Before we begin, what this book is. This book was written by a man who had no wish to be a martyr. René Descartes was 44 years old, living in a comfortable house in the Netherlands, far from the turbulence of Paris and the watchful eyes of the Sorbonne. He had seen Galileo condemned. He had locked away his own treatise on the world, afraid that it might bring the same fate upon him. But he could not stay silent forever. In 1641, he published a small book, written in Latin, the language of the schools, though its arguments would destroy the philosophy of the schools. It is not a treatise, it is a drama. A man sits alone by the fire in a winter night and decides to doubt everything he has ever believed. His senses have deceived him. His reason might be deceiving him now. There might be an evil demon of the utmost power and cunning who bends all his efforts to deceive him. And so he strips away the whole world, the sky, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds. All might be dreams. His own body might be an illusion. Mathematics itself might be a lie. And then in the darkness, he finds one thing that cannot be doubted. I am. I exist. Every time I say it or conceive it in my mind, it is necessarily true. I think, therefore I am. From that slender thread, he hangs the whole universe. He proves that God exists and that God is not a deceiver. He proves that the material world is real and that the soul is distinct from the body and that it is immortal. Whether the proofs hold, that is for each reader to decide. But the method, the turning inward, the demand for certainty, the refusal to accept anything that can be doubted, that method has never been surpassed. This is the Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the immortality of the soul are demonstrated. By René Descartes, 1641. My name is Jamil. You are listening to the Classic Mind. Here we read the great books the way they were written, line by line, word by word. No summaries, no paraphrases, no one explaining to you what a great book says. The book itself, alive, in the voice. If you are tired of hearing about philosophy and ready to hear philosophy itself, if you are tired of hearing about literature and ready to hear the actual words, you are in the right place. This is not a lecture. This is a reading, a meditation, a sitting in the quiet with a voice that does not hurry. I invite you to close your eyes and let the book speak. This is the Classic Mind. Let us begin. Meditations on First Philosophy. Preface to the reader. I have already slightly touched on the questions respecting the existence of God and the human soul. In the discourse on the method of rightly conducting the reason and seeking truth in the sciences, published in French in the year 1637. It was not my purpose there to treat of them fully, but only by the way, that I might learn from the judgment of my readers in what manner I should afterwards handle them. For these questions have always appeared to me to be of such moment that I judged it suitable to speak of them more than once, and the road which I follow in the explanation of them is so little trodden and so far out of the way of ordinary practice that I thought it would not be useful to explain it at greater length in French, and in a discourse that might be read by everybody, lest even the feebler minds should believe that this path was open for them to tread. Now, as in the discourse on method, I had requested all who should find anything worthy of censure in my writings to do me the favor of making me acquainted with it. No objection of any moment has been adduced touching those I made on these questions, save two. To these two objections I will here briefly reply, before undertaking their more thorough discussion. The first objection is this: from the circumstance that the human mind, when turned in upon itself, does not perceive itself to be other than a thinking thing, it does not follow that its nature or essence consists solely in its being a thing that thinks, so that the word solely shall exclude all those other things that might perhaps be affirmed to belong to the nature of the soul. To this objection I reply, that it was not my intention in that place to exclude those other things according to the order of truth, for I was not then treating of them, but only according to the order of my perception. My meaning, therefore, was this: I was not aware of my knowing anything at all that I knew to belong to my essence, except that I was a thinking thing, that is, a being who doubts, who affirms, who denies, who knows a few things, who is ignorant of many, who loves, who hates, who wills, who does not will, who also imagines and perceives. For though, as I have before remarked, it may be true that I have a body that is very closely conjoined with me, yet because on the one hand I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, in so far as I am only a thinking and unextended thing, and because, on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of my body in so far as it is only an extended and unthinking thing, it is certain that I am truly distinct from my body and can exist without it. The second objection is this: from the circumstance that I have in myself the idea of a more perfect thing than I am, it does not follow that the idea itself is more perfect than I am, much less that what is represented by this idea exists. But I reply that in the word idea there is here an equivocation, for it may be taken either materially for an operation of the understanding, and in this sense it cannot be said to be more perfect than I am, or objectively, for the thing represented by this operation, and this, though it be not supposed to exist out of my understanding, may nevertheless be more perfect than myself by reason of its essence. But in the sequel of this treatise, I shall show more amply how from my having the idea of a thing more perfect than myself, it follows that this thing really exists. Moreover, I have also seen two other sufficiently ample works on this subject. In them, however, it was not so much the questions themselves that were attacked, as my conclusions, by arguments borrowed from the commonplaces of the atheists. But since arguments of this sort can have no weight with those who understand my reasonings, and since the judgments of many are so foolish and perverse that they allow themselves to be convinced more readily by the first opinions that come to them, however false and repugnant to reason, than by the solid and true but afterwards received refutation of these opinions, I do not wish here to answer them, lest I should first have to state them. I shall only add in general that all that the atheists commonly allege to combat the existence of God always rests on one or other of these two things, either on the fact that we attribute human affections to him, or on the fact that we claim so much force and wisdom for our own minds. that we presume to determine and comprehend what God can and ought to do, so that all that they allege will give us no difficulty, provided we only remember that our minds must be regarded as finite and God as incomprehensible and infinite. Now, since I have once for all made trial of the judgments of men, I here again attack the same questions respecting God and the human soul, and at the same time treat of the beginnings of the whole of first philosophy. But I do this in such a way that I must expect no commendation from the crowd, nor any wide circle of readers. On the contrary, I would not urge anyone to read this book, except those who are able and willing to meditate seriously along with me, to withdraw their minds from the senses, and at the same time from all their forward prejudices. Such readers, I well know, are very few. But as for those who, without caring much about the order and connection of my reasonings, amuse themselves by picking its single sentences, as is the custom of many, they will derive little profit from the reading of this treatise. And although they may perhaps find occasion for much cavilling, they will hardly be able to urge any objection that is serious or deserving of reply. But since I do not promise to satisfy even the others at first sight, nor am I so presumptuous as to believe myself capable of foreseeing all the difficulties that may occur to anyone, I shall first set forth in these meditations the very same thoughts by which I persuade myself that I have reached a certain and evident knowledge of the truth, in order to try whether the same arguments that have convinced me may also serve to convince others. And after that, I shall reply to the objections of several persons, illustrious for their genius and learning, to whom these meditations were sent for examination before they were printed. For the objections they have raised are so many and so different, that I dare to hope there will be nothing easily occurring to anyone, at least nothing of any moment, that has not been touched upon by them. I therefore earnestly entreat my readers not to come to any judgment on these meditations until they have taken the trouble to read through all these objections and my replies to them. Synopsis of the 6 following meditations. In the first meditation, I set forth the reasons for which we may, generally speaking, doubt about all things, and especially about material objects, at least so long as we have no other foundations for the sciences than those which we have hitherto possessed. Now, although the utility of a doubt that is so general does not at first appear, it is nevertheless of the greatest use, since it delivers us from every kind of prejudice, and sets out for us a very simple way by which the mind may detach itself from the senses. And finally, it makes it impossible for us to doubt wherever we afterwards discover truth. In the second meditation, the mind, which in the exercise of its own freedom supposes the non-existence of all those things of whose existence it has even the slightest doubt, perceives that it is absolutely impossible that it itself does not exist. And this is of the highest utility, since in this way the mind readily distinguishes between what belongs to it, that is, to the intellectual nature, and what belongs to the body. But since it may be that some will expect from me, in this place, arguments for the immortality of the soul, I think it right to warn them that having endeavored to write nothing in this treatise, of which I have not very exact demonstrations, I find myself obliged to follow an order similar to that in use among the geometers, which is to set down all the things on which the proposition we are seeking depends, before coming to any conclusion regarding it. Now, the first and principal thing that is required for knowing that the soul is immortal is that we should form the clearest possible concept of the soul itself, and one that is entirely distinct from all the concepts of body. And this is here done. But besides this, it is also necessary to know that all the things which we conceive clearly and distinctly are true in the manner in which we conceive them. This could not be proved before the fourth meditation. Further, we must have a distinct conception of corporeal nature, which is formed partly in the second meditation, and partly in the fifth and sixth. And from all this, we must conclude that all those things which are conceived clearly and distinctly as being diverse substances, as mind and body are conceived, are in truth substances really distinct from one another. And this I conclude in the sixth meditation. It is also confirmed in the same meditation by the fact that we cannot conceive of body except as being divisible, whereas the mind cannot be conceived except as indivisible. For we cannot conceive half of a mind as we can of any body, however small. Thus their natures are recognized not only as diverse, but even in some measure as contraries. Now I have not pursued this subject further in this treatise, both because these considerations suffice to show plainly enough that the extinction of the mind does not follow from the corruption of the body, and also to give men the hope of another life after death, as also because the premises from which the immortality of the soul may be deduced depend on an explanation of the whole of physics. There it must be shown, first, that all substances generally, that is, things which cannot exist without being created by God, are by their nature incorruptible, and can never cease to be unless they be reduced to nothing by the same God who denies them his concurrence. And secondly, it must be observed that body, taken in general, is a substance, and therefore never perishes. But the human body, insofar as it differs from other bodies, is merely composed of a certain configuration of members and of other similar accidents, while the human mind is not similarly composed of any accidents, but is a pure substance. For although all the accidents of the mind may be changed, although it may understand certain things, will others, perceive others, etc., it is always the same mind. But the human body is no longer the same if only the figure of some of its parts is changed. From this it follows that the human body may indeed easily enough perish, but that the mind, in virtue of its nature, is immortal. In the third meditation, I have unfolded at sufficient length, as it seems to me, my principal argument for proving the existence of God. However, since I did not wish to employ any comparisons drawn from corporeal things, in order to withdraw as far as I could the minds of my readers from the senses, perhaps many confusions may remain, which I hope will afterwards be entirely removed in the replies to the objections. Thus, among other things, it is asked how the idea of a supremely perfect being, which is in us, possesses so much objective reality that it must come from a supremely perfect cause. This I have illustrated in the replies by the comparison of a very perfect machine, the idea of which is found in the mind of some workmen. For just as the objective artifice of this idea must have some cause, namely, either the knowledge of the workman, or that of some other person from whom he has received it, so the idea of God, which is in us, can have no other cause than God himself. In the fourth meditation, it is proved that all that we clearly and distinctly perceive is true, and at the same time, it is explained in what the nature of error consists. This must necessarily be known both for the confirmation of the preceding truths and for the understanding of those that follow. But at the same time, it must be observed that I do not there treat of sin, that is, of error committed in the pursuit of good and evil, but only of that which occurs in the judgment of the true and the false. And I do not intend to speak of things that pertain to faith or the conduct of life, but only of those that concern speculative truths, and which may be known by the light of nature alone. In the fifth meditation, among other things, I also explain corporeal nature in general, and I demonstrate the existence of God by a new argument. In that argument, again, certain difficulties may arise, but these are afterwards resolved in the replies to the objections. And finally, I show in what sense it is true to say that the certainty of even geometrical demonstrations depends on the knowledge of God. In the sixth meditation, the intellect is distinguished from the imagination. The marks of this distinction are described. The mind is proved to be really distinct from the body, and yet to be so closely conjoined with it as to form, as it were, a single thing. All the errors that arise from the senses are then reviewed, together with the means of avoiding them. And finally, I set forth all the reasons from which the existence of material things can be concluded. Not that I judge them to be very useful for proving what they demonstrate, namely, that there really is a world, that men possess bodies, and other such things, which have never been seriously doubted by any man of sense. The usefulness lies rather in this, that in considering these reasons, we come to know that they are not so firm or so evident as those arguments that lead us to the knowledge of God and of our own soul, so that these latter are the most certain and the most evident of all that can enter the human mind. And to prove this one thing is the sole end of these meditations. Wherefore I shall not here speak of many other questions, which I also treat of, as occasion offers, in the course of the work. Meditation 1 of the things of which we may doubt. It is now some years since I detected how many were the false beliefs that I had, from my earliest youth admitted as true, and how doubtful was everything I had since constructed on this basis. And from this, I became convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of all the opinions which I had formerly accepted, and commence to build anew from the foundation, if I wanted to establish any firm and permanent structure in the sciences. But this enterprise appeared to me to be very great, and I waited until I had attained an age so mature that I could no longer hope that any later time of life would be more suitable for executing the work. And for this reason, I delayed so long that I should henceforth be at fault if I were to waste on deliberation the time that remains for acting. The time then has arrived, and I have freed my mind from every kind of care, and have procured for myself assured leisure in a peaceable retirement. I shall therefore apply myself earnestly and freely to this general destruction of all my former opinions. But to this end it will not be necessary for me to show that all my opinions are false, a thing which I could perhaps never accomplish. But inasmuch as reason already persuades me that I ought no less carefully to withhold my assent from matters which are not entirely certain and indubitable than from those which are manifestly false, it will be sufficient to justify the rejection of the whole, if I shall find in each some ground for doubt. Nor for this purpose need I run through them all, one by one, which would be an endless labor. But, because the fall of the foundations necessarily brings with it the downfall of the rest of the edifice, I shall attack those principles upon which all my former opinions rested. All that I have, up to this moment, accepted as possessed of the highest truth and certainty, I have received either from the senses or through the senses. But I have found that these senses sometimes deceive me, and it is a matter of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once. But though the senses sometimes deceive us regarding things that are very small or very far off, there are yet many other things that cannot reasonably be doubted, though we derive them from the senses. For example, that I am here sitting by the fire, wearing a winter cloak, holding this paper in my hands, and other things of this nature. And how could I deny that these hands and this body are mine, save perhaps by comparing myself to those insane persons whose brains are so disturbed and clouded by the black vapors of the bile that they constantly assert that they are kings, though they are paupers, or that they are clothed in purple, though they are naked, or that they have a head of clay, or that they are gourds, or made of glass. But they are madmen, and I should not be any the less extravagant if I were to follow their example. Nevertheless, I must remember that I am a man, and that, consequently, I am accustomed to sleep, and in my dreams to imagine the same things, or sometimes even less probable things, than those madmen do when they are awake. How often has it happened to me that in the night I dreamt that I found myself in this particular place, that I was dressed and sitting by the fire, whilst in reality I was lying undressed in bed. At this moment, it does indeed seem to me that it is with wide-awake eyes that I am looking at this paper, that this head which I move is not asleep, that it is deliberately and of set purpose that I extend my hand and perceive it. What happens in sleep does not appear so clear and distinct as all this. But in thinking this over, I remind myself that on many occasions I have in sleep been deceived by similar illusions. And in dwelling carefully on this reflection, I see so manifestly that there are no certain indications by which we may clearly distinguish between wakefulness and sleep, that I am lost in astonishment. And my astonishment is such that it is almost capable of persuading me that I am now dreaming. Now let us assume that we are asleep, and that all these particular things, such as our opening our eyes, moving our head, stretching out our hands, are not true actions, and that perhaps we do not even possess such hands or such a body. At the same time, we must at least confess that the things which are represented to us in sleep are like painted representations which can only have been formed as the counterparts of something real and true, and that in this way those general things at least, that is eyes, a head, hands, and a whole body are not imaginary things, but really existent. For as a matter of fact, painters, even when they study with the greatest skill to represent sirens and satyrs by the most fantastic forms, cannot give them natures which are entirely new, but merely make a certain medley of the limbs of different animals. Or if their imagination is extravagant enough to invent something so novel that nothing similar has ever before been seen, and that their work represents a thing purely fictitious and absolutely false, at least the colors used in the composition must be real. And for the same reason, even although these general things, to wit, a body, eyes, a head, hands, and such like, might be imaginary, we are bound at the same time to confess that there are at least some other, still more simple and universal things, which are real and true, from which, as from real colors, all these images of things, whether true or false, that reside in our thought, are formed. To this class of things seems to belong corporeal nature in general, and its extension, the figure of extended things, their quantity or magnitude, and their number, as also the place in which they are, the time during which they measure, and such like. And it is for this reason, perhaps, that from all this we shall not wrongly conclude that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all the other sciences depending on the consideration of composite things are very dubious and uncertain, but that arithmetic, geometry, and other sciences of that kind, which only treat of things that are very simple and very general, without taking great trouble to ascertain whether they are actually existent or not, contain some measure of certainty and an element that is indubitable. For whether I am awake or asleep, 2 and 3 together always form 5, and the square can never have more than 4 sides. And it does not seem possible that truths so clear and apparent can be suspected of any falsity or uncertainty. Nevertheless, I have long had fixed in my mind the belief that an all-powerful God existed, by whom I have been created such as I am. But how do I know that he has not brought it to pass that there is no earth, no heaven, no extended body, no magnitude, no place, and that nevertheless they seem to me to exist just exactly as they are now? And further, as I sometimes think that others are mistaken in the things they think they know best, how do I know that I am not myself deceived every time I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or form a judgment of something even simpler, if anything simpler can be imagined? But perhaps God has not been willing that I should be thus deceived, for he is said to be supremely good. If, however, it is repugnant to his goodness to have made me such that I am constantly deceived, it would seem also to be contrary to his goodness to permit me to be sometimes deceived, and yet this last is not something I can doubt. Some, indeed, might rather prefer to deny the existence of a God so powerful than to believe that all other things are uncertain. But let us not argue against them at present, and grant that all that is here said of God is a fable. Nevertheless, in whatever way they suppose that I have come to the state of being that I have reached, whether they attribute it to some fate or destiny, or refer it to chance, or wish to explain it by a continual succession of things, or by any other means, since to be deceived and to err appear to be a certain defect, It is clear that the greater is the probability of the cause to which they assign my origin, the less reason they have to believe that I am not constantly deceived. And to these reasons I have certainly nothing to reply, but at the end I am constrained to confess that there is nothing in all that I formerly believed to be true, of which I cannot in some measure doubt, and this not through thoughtlessness or levity, but from very strong and maturely considered reasons. So that henceforth I ought no less carefully to refrain from giving credence to these opinions than to what might be manifestly false, if I desire to arrive at any certainty. But it is not sufficient to have made these remarks. We must also be careful to keep them in mind, for these ancient and commonly held opinions still revert frequently to my mind, my long and familiar acquaintance giving them the right to occupy my mind against my inclination, and rendered almost masters of my belief. Nor will I ever lose the habit of deferring to them and of placing my confidence in them, so long as I consider them as in effect they truly are. That is to say, in some measure doubtful, as I have just shown, and yet at the same time highly probable, so that there is much more reason to believe in them than to deny them. That is why, without any scruple, I consider that I shall act most prudently if, taking a contrary course, I deceive myself, and suppose for a certain time that all these opinions are entirely false and imaginary, until at last, having balanced my former prejudices with my latter, my judgment will no longer be turned aside by custom from the right perception of things. For I am assured that there can be neither peril nor error in this course, and that I cannot at present yield too much to my distrust, since my design now is not to apply myself to action, but only to the acquisition of knowledge. I shall therefore suppose not that God, who is supremely good and the fountain of truth, but that some evil genius, no less powerful than deceitful, has employed his whole energies in deceiving me. I shall consider that the heavens, the earth, colors, figures, sound, and all other external things are naught but the illusions and dreams of which this evil genius has availed himself in order to lay traps for my credulity. I shall consider myself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, nor any senses, yet falsely believing myself to possess all these things. I shall remain obstinately attached to this thought, and if by this means it is not in my power to arrive at the knowledge of any truth, I may at least do what is in my power, that is, suspend my judgment, and guard myself by a firm resolution from ever giving credence to any false thing, or from being imposed upon by this arch deceiver, however powerful and deceptive he may be. But this design is painful and laborious, and a certain sloth insensibly leads me back to my ordinary course of life. And just as a captive, who in sleep enjoys an imaginary liberty, when he afterwards begins to suspect that his liberty is but a dream, fears to be awakened, and conspires with these agreeable illusions that the deception may be prolonged, so insensibly do I fall back of myself into my former opinions, and I dread being awakened from my slumber, lest the wakeful hours which would follow such a peaceful rest, instead of bringing me any light of day, should be wholly spent in darkness among all the difficulties I have just raised. Meditation 2. of the nature of the human mind, and that it is more easily known than the body. The meditation of yesterday filled my mind with so many doubts that it is no longer in my power to forget them. And yet I do not see in what manner I can resolve them. And, just as if I had all of a sudden fallen into very deep water, I am so disconcerted that I can neither make certain of setting my feet on the bottom, nor can I swim and so support myself on the surface. I shall nevertheless make an effort, and follow anew the same path as that on which I had entered yesterday. That is, I shall proceed by setting aside all that in which the least doubt could be supposed to exist, just as if I had discovered that it was absolutely false. And I shall ever follow in this road until I have met with something which is certain, or at least, if I can do nothing else, until I have learned for certain that there is nothing in the world that is certain. Archimedes, in order that he might draw the terrestrial globe out of its place and transport it elsewhere, demanded only that one point should be fixed and immovable. In the same way, I shall have the right to conceive high hopes. If I am happy enough to discover one thing only which is certain and indubitable, I suppose then that all the things that I see are false. I persuade myself that nothing has ever existed of all that my fallacious memory represents to me. I consider that I possess no senses. I imagine that body, figure, extension, movement, and place are but the fictions of my mind. What then can be esteemed as true? Perhaps nothing at all, unless that there is nothing in the world that is certain. But how do I know that there is not some other thing different from those which I have just considered, of which one cannot have the slightest doubt? Is there not some God, or some other being by whatever name we call him, who puts these reflections into my mind? That is not necessary, for perhaps I am able to produce them myself. I myself, then, at least, am I not something? But I have already denied that I had senses and body. Yet I hesitate, for what follows from that? Am I so dependent on body and senses that I cannot exist without these? But I was persuaded that there was nothing at all in the world, that there was no heaven, no earth, that there were no minds, nor any bodies. Was I not then likewise persuaded that I did not exist? Not at all. Of a surety I myself did exist, since I persuaded myself of something, or merely because I thought of something. But there is some deceiver or other, very powerful and very cunning, who ever employs his ingenuity in deceiving me. Then without doubt I exist also, if he is deceiving me. And let him deceive me as much as he will. He can never cause me to be nothing so long as I think that I am something. So that after having reflected well and carefully examined all things, we must come to the definite conclusion that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time that I pronounce it, or that I mentally conceive it. But I do not yet know clearly enough what I am, and hence I must be careful, lest perchance I inconsiderately mistake some other object in place of myself, and thus go astray even in that knowledge which I hold to be the most certain and the most evident of all that I have formerly learned. That is why I shall now consider anew what I believed myself to be before I embarked on these last reflections. And of my former opinions, I shall withdraw all that might, even in a small degree, be invalidated by the reasons which I have just brought forward, in order that there may be nothing at all left beyond what is absolutely certain and indubitable. What then did I formerly believe myself to be? Undoubtedly, I believed myself to be a man. But what is a man? Shall I say a reasonable animal? Certainly not, for then I should have to inquire what an animal is and what is reasonable. And thus, from a single question, I should insensibly fall into an infinitude of others, more difficult and more embarrassing than the first. And I do not possess time enough to waste it in subtleties of this nature. But I shall rather stop here to consider the thoughts which of themselves sprang up in my mind, and which were inspired by my own nature alone, when I applied myself to the consideration of my being. In the first place, then, I considered myself as having a face, hands, arms, and all that system of members composed of bones and flesh, as seen in a corpse, which I designated by the name of body. In addition to this, I considered that I was nourished, that I walked, that I felt, and that I thought, and I referred all these actions to the soul. But I did not stop to consider what the soul was, or if I did stop, I imagined that it was something extremely rare and subtle, like a wind, a flame, or an ether, which was spread throughout my grosser parts. As to body, I had no doubt about its nature. I thought that I knew it distinctly, and if I had tried to describe the mental conception I had of it, I would have described it thus. By body, I understand all that can be terminated by some figure, that can be comprised in some place, and fill a space in such a way that every other body is excluded from it, that can be perceived either by touch, or by sight, or by hearing, or by taste, or by smell, that can be moved in many ways, not by itself, but by some other thing by which it is touched. For I judge that the power of self-motion, and likewise that of perceiving or of thinking, in no way pertain to the nature of body. On the contrary, I was rather astonished to see that similar faculties were found in certain bodies. But what am I, now that I suppose that there is a certain genius who is extremely powerful, and, if I dare to say so, malicious and cunning, who employs all his powers and industry to deceive me? Can I affirm that I possess the least of all those things which I have just said pertain to the nature of body? I pause to consider, I revolve all these things in my mind, and I find none of which I can say that it pertains to me. It would be tedious to enumerate them one by one. Let us pass to the attributes of the soul, and see if there is any one of them which is in me. What of nutrition, or walking? But if it is true that I have no body, it is also true that I can neither walk nor take nourishment. Another attribute is sensation. But one cannot feel without body. And besides, I have thought I perceived many things during sleep that I afterwards recognized I did not actually perceive. Thinking is another attribute of the soul, and here I discover what properly belongs to myself. This alone is inseparable from me. I exist, that is certain, but for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For it might possibly be, if I ceased entirely to think, that I should likewise cease altogether to exist. I do not now admit anything which is not necessarily true. Accordingly, I am nothing but a thinking thing, that is to say, a mind, or understanding, or reason, words whose significance was formerly unknown to me. I am, however, a real thing, a really existent thing. But what thing? I have answered, a thing that thinks. And what more? I shall set myself to consider that I am not that structure of limbs which is called a human body. I am not even some thin vapor which permeates the limbs, a wind, a flame, a vapor, a breath, or anything at all that I can feign. I have supposed that all these things are nothing, but, without changing this supposition, I find that I do not cease to be certain that I am something. But perhaps it is true that these same things, which I supposed were non-existent because they are unknown to me, are really not different from the self which I know. I do not know. I shall not dispute about this now. I can only judge of things that are known to me. I know that I exist, and I inquire what I am, I whom I know to exist. But it is very certain that this knowledge of myself, taken in the strict sense, does not depend on things of whose existence I am still ignorant. Consequently, it does not depend on any of the things I can feign in my imagination. And this very word feign warns me of my error. For I should, in truth, be feigning if I imagined myself to be something. For to imagine is nothing else than to contemplate the figure or image of a corporeal thing. But I already know for certain that I am, and that it may be that all these images, and generally speaking, all things that relate to the nature of body, are nothing but dreams and chimeras, that there is as little reason to say, I shall stimulate my imagination in order to know more distinctly what I am, as to say, I am awake now, and I perceive something that is real and true, but because I do not yet perceive it distinctly enough, I shall go to sleep, so that my dreams may represent the perception with the greatest evidence and truth. And thus I know for certain that nothing of all that I can understand by means of my imagination belongs to this knowledge which I have of myself, and that it is necessary to recall the mind from this mode of thought with the utmost diligence, in order that it may be able to know its own nature with perfect distinctness. But what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is a thing that thinks? It is a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, is unwilling, and also imagines and has sense perceptions. Certainly it is no small matter if all these things pertain to my nature. But why should they not so pertain? Am I not that very being who now doubts of almost everything, who nevertheless understands certain things, who affirms that one only is true and denies the rest, who desires to know more, is averse from being deceived, who imagines many things, sometimes indeed despite his will, and who likewise perceives many things as if through the medium of the senses? Is there anything in all this that is not as true as it is certain that I exist, even if I were always asleep, and even if he who created me employed all his powers to deceive me? Is there also any one of these attributes that can be distinguished from my thought, or that might be said to be separate from myself? For it is so evident of itself that it is I who doubt, who understand, and who desire, that there is no reason here to add anything to explain it. And I have certainly the power of imagining likewise. For although it may happen, as I formerly supposed, that none of the things which I imagine are true, yet this power of imagining does not cease to be really in use, and forms a part of my thought. Finally, I am the same who perceives, that is, who apprehends certain things as by the organs of sense, since in truth I see light, I hear noise, I feel heat. But it will be said that these phenomena are false, and that I am dreaming. Be it so. Still it is at least quite certain that it seems to me that I see light, that I hear noise, and that I feel heat. That cannot be false. Properly speaking, this is what in me is called perception, and this, taken precisely, is nothing else than thinking. From this I begin to know what I am, with somewhat greater clearness and distinctness than heretofore. But nevertheless, it still seems to me, and I cannot prevent myself from thinking, that corporeal things, whose images are framed by thought, and which the senses themselves examine, are much more distinctly known than that obscure part of me which does not come under the imagination. Although, in truth, it is very strange to say that I know and understand more distinctly these things whose existence seems to me dubious, that are unknown to me, and that do not belong to me in truth, than others of the truth of which I am convinced, which are known to me and which pertain to my real nature, in a word, than myself. But I see clearly what the state of the case is. My mind loves to wander, and cannot yet suffer itself to be retained within the just limits of truth. Let us therefore give it the rein one more time, so that when afterwards we seize the proper occasion for pulling up, it may the more easily be regulated. Let us begin by considering the commonest matters, those which we believe to be the most distinctly comprehended, to wit, the bodies which we touch and see. Not bodies in general, for these general ideas are usually a little more confused, but let us consider one body in particular. Let us take, for example, this piece of wax. It has just been taken from the hive. It has not yet quite lost the sweetness of the honey it contained. It still retains somewhat of the odor of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, its figure, its size are apparent. It is hard, cold, easily handled, and if you strike it with the finger, it will emit a sound. Finally, all the things which can be required to make us know a body distinctly are met within it. But behold, while I am speaking, it is brought close to the fire. The savors that remained are exhaled, the smell evaporates, the color alters, the figure is destroyed, the size increases, it becomes liquid, it heats, scarcely can one handle it, and when one strikes it, no sound is emitted. Does the same wax remain after this change? We must confess that it remains. No one would judge otherwise. What then did I know so distinctly in this piece of wax? It could certainly be nothing of all that the senses brought to my notice, since all these things which fall under taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing are found to be changed, and yet the same wax remains. Perhaps it was what I now think, namely that this wax was not that sweetness of honey, nor that agreeable scent of flowers, nor that whiteness, nor that figure, nor that sound, but only a body which a little while before appeared to me under these forms, and which now makes itself apparent under others. But what is it, precisely, that I imagine when I form such conceptions. Let us consider it attentively, and removing all that does not belong to the wax, let us see what remains. Certainly nothing remains except something extended, flexible, and movable. But what is this flexible and movable? Is it not that I imagine that this piece of wax, being round, is capable of becoming square, and of passing from a square to a triangular figure? No, certainly it is not that, since I conceive that it admits of an infinitude of similar changes. And I could not, nevertheless, run through this infinitude by my imagination. Consequently, this conception which I have of the wax is not brought about by the faculty of imagination. What now is this extension? Is it also not known? For in the melting wax it increases and becomes far greater when the wax is more melted. It becomes still greater when the heat is much increased. And I should not conceive clearly, according to truth, what the wax was, if I did not think that even this piece of wax is capable of receiving more varieties of extension than I have ever imagined. We must therefore grant that I could not even comprehend through the imagination what this piece of wax is, and that it is my understanding alone which comprehends it. I say this piece of wax in particular, for as to wax in general, this is still more evident. But what is this piece of wax which cannot be understood except by the understanding, or the mind? It is certainly the same that I see, that I touch, that I picture in my imagination. In short, it is the same which, from the start, I believed it to be. But what must be noted here is that its perception is neither an act of sight, nor of touch, nor of imagination, and has never been such, although it may have formerly appeared so. It is solely an inspection of the mind, and this inspection may be imperfect and confused, as it was formerly, or clear and distinct, as it is at present, according as my attention is directed more or less to the things which are in it, and of which it is composed. But I am greatly astonished when I consider how weak my mind is, and how prone to error. For even without my expressing it in words, I conceive all this in myself, and yet words themselves may impede my progress, and I may almost be deceived by the terms of ordinary language. For we say that we see the same wax if it is present before us, and not that we judge it to be the same from its having the same color and figure. From this, I should conclude that I knew the wax by means of vision, and not simply by the intuition of the mind. But were I by chance to look from a window at men passing in the street, I should not fail to say that I see men, just as I say that I see the wax. And yet what do I see from this window beyond hats and cloaks, which may cover artificial machines, whose motions might be determined by springs? But I judge that they are men, and thus something which I thought I saw with my eyes is in truth comprehended solely by the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. He who wishes to elevate his thought above the common level of men should be ashamed to derive occasions for doubt from the forms and terms of ordinary speech. Let us proceed rather to consider whether I conceived with more evidence and perfection what the wax was, when I first perceived it, and believed I knew it by means of the external senses, or at least by the common sense, as it is called. that is, by the imaginative faculty, or whether I rather conceive it more clearly now, after having more carefully examined what it is, and in what way it can be known. It would certainly be absurd to doubt this, for what was there in this first perception that was distinct? What was there that might not as well have been perceived by any of the animals? But when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, and just as if I had taken off its clothes, consider it quite naked, it is certain that although some error may still be found in my judgment, I cannot nevertheless conceive it in this way without a human mind. But finally, what shall I say of this mind, that is, of myself? For up to this point, I do not admit in myself anything but mind. What then I, who seem to perceive this piece of wax so distinctly, do I not know myself, not only with much more truth and certainty, but also with much more distinctness and clearness? For if I judge that the wax is, or exists from the fact that I see it, it certainly follows much more evidently that I am, or that I exist myself, from the fact that I see it. For it may be that what I see is not in truth wax. It may also be that I do not even possess eyes with which to see anything. But it cannot be that when I see, or for I no longer distinguish the one from the other, when I think I see, that I who think am not something. So if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I touch it, the same conclusion follows, namely, that I am. And if I judge it from the fact that my imagination persuades me of it, or from whatever other cause it may be, I shall always draw the same conclusion. And what I have here remarked of the wax may be applied to all other things which are external to me. And further, if the notion or perception of wax has seemed to me clearer and more distinct, not only after the sight or the touch, but also after many other causes have rendered it manifest, with how much more evidence and distinctness must it be said that I now know myself, since all the reasons that serve to conceive the nature of wax, or of any other body, prove much better the nature of my own mind. And there are so many other things in the mind itself that may contribute to the elucidation of its nature, that those which depend on body, such as these I have just mentioned, hardly merit being taken into account. But finally, here I am, having insensibly returned to the point I desired. For since it is now manifest to me that even bodies are not properly known by the senses, or by the faculty of imagination, but by the understanding alone, and that they are not known from the fact that they are seen or touched, but only from the fact that they are understood, I see clearly that there is nothing that is easier for me to know than my own mind. But because it is difficult to rid oneself so promptly of an opinion to which one has been accustomed for so long, it will be well that I should stop here, so that by the length of my meditation I may more deeply imprint this new knowledge on my memory. Meditation 3 of God, that He exists. I shall now close my eyes. I shall stop my ears. I shall call away all my senses. I shall efface even from my thoughts all the images of corporeal things, or at least, for that is hardly possible, I shall esteem them as vain and false. And thus, holding converse only with myself, and considering my own inwardness, I shall try little by little to make myself better known and more familiar to myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is to say, that doubts, affirms, denies, that knows a few things, that is ignorant of many, that loves, that hates, that wills, that desires, that also imagines and perceives. For as I remarked before, although the things which I perceive and imagine are perhaps nothing at all apart from me and in themselves, I am nevertheless assured that these modes of thought, which I call perceptions and imaginations, in as far as they are modes of thought, reside in and are met with in me. And in the little I have just said, I think I have summed up all that I truly know, or at least all that hitherto I have discovered that I know. Now, in order to try to extend my knowledge further, I shall look around more carefully and see whether I cannot still discover in myself some other things which I have not hitherto perceived. I am certain that I am a thing that thinks. But do I not then likewise know what is requisite to make me certain of a truth? Certainly in this first knowledge there is nothing that assures me of its truth, except the clear and distinct perception of that which I state. And this would not indeed be sufficient to assure me that what I say is true, if it could ever happen that a thing which I conceive so clearly and distinctly could be false. And accordingly, it seems to me that I can already establish, as a general rule, that all things which I perceive very clearly and very distinctly are true. Nevertheless, I have already received and admitted many things as very certain and very manifest, which yet I afterwards recognized as being doubtful. What then were these things? They were the earth, the sky, the stars, and all other objects which I apprehended by means of the senses. But what did I clearly and distinctly perceive in them? Nothing more than that the ideas or thoughts of these things were presented to my mind. And not even now do I deny that these ideas are met within me. But there was yet another thing which I affirmed, and which, owing to the habit which I had formed of believing it, I thought I perceived very clearly, although in truth I did not perceive it at all. I mean that there were objects outside of me from which these ideas proceeded, and to which they were entirely similar. And it was in this that I was mistaken. Or, if I judged correctly, this was not due to any knowledge. That I possessed. But when I considered something very simple and easy touching arithmetic and geometry, for example, that 2 and 3 together make 5, and other similar matters, did I not conceive them at least sufficiently clearly to be able to affirm that they were true? Certainly, if I have since judged that these things could be doubted, it was for no other reason than because it occurred to me that perhaps some God had given me such a nature that I might be deceived even concerning those matters that appear most manifest. But every time that this preconceived opinion of the sovereign power of a God presents itself to my thought, I am constrained to confess that it is easy for him, if he wishes it, to cause me to err, even in matters in which I believe myself to have the best evidence. And on the other hand, always when I turn my attention to the things which I believe myself to perceive very clearly, I am so entirely persuaded of them that I am carried away of myself into saying, "Let him who can deceive me, he can never cause me to be nothing while I think that I am something, or some day cause it to be true that I have never existed, it being true now that I am." or perhaps even cause 2 and 3 to make more or less than 5, or other things of this kind, in which I see a manifest contradiction. And certainly, since I have no reason to believe that there is a God who is a deceiver, and as yet I have not even satisfied myself that there is a God at all, the reason for doubt which depends on this opinion alone is very slight, and so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to be able to remove it entirely, I must examine whether there is a God, as soon as an occasion presents itself. And if I find that there is a God, I must also examine whether he may be a deceiver. For without a knowledge of these two truths, I do not see that I can ever be certain of anything. And in order that I may have an opportunity of examining this, without interrupting the order of meditation which I have proposed to myself, which is to pass little by little from the notions that I find first of all in my mind, to those that I may later find in it. It is necessary here to divide all my thoughts into certain kinds, and to consider in which of these kinds truth or error properly lies. Among my thoughts, some are like the images of things, and it is to these alone that the name idea is properly applied. Thus, when I represent to myself a man, or a chimera, or the sky, or an angel, or God himself, others again have other forms. For instance, when I will, when I fear, when I affirm, when I deny, I always in truth conceive of something as the subject of my thought. But I also embrace in thought something more than the likeness of that thing. Of thoughts of this kind, some are called volitions or affections, and others judgments. Now, as to what concerns ideas, if we consider them only in themselves, and do not relate them to anything else beyond themselves, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether I imagine a goat or a chimera, it is not less true that I imagine the one than the other. We need not fear any falsity in the affections or volitions. For although I may desire evil things, or even things that never existed, it is not for this reason less true that I desire them. Thus there remain only judgments, in which I must take the greatest care not to be deceived. Now the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in my judging that the ideas which are in me are similar to or conformable to things which are outside me. For if I only considered ideas themselves as certain modes of my thought, without referring them to anything else, they could scarcely give me any material for error. But among these ideas, some appear to me to be innate, some adventitious, and others to be formed or invented by myself. For as to the faculty of understanding what is meant by a thing, or truth, or thought, it appears to me that I hold this from no other source than my own nature. But if I now hear some sound, if I see the sun, if I feel heat, I have hitherto judged that these sensations proceeded from certain things that exist outside of me. And finally, it appears to me that sirens, hippogriffs, and the like are formed by my own mind. But again, I may perhaps persuade myself that all these ideas are of the kind which I term adventitious, or else that they are all innate, or again that they are all fictitious. For I have not yet clearly discovered their true origin. What I must here principally do is to consider, As to those ideas which appear to me to proceed from certain objects that are outside me, what are the reasons which cause me to believe them similar to these objects? The first of these reasons is that it seems to me that I am so taught by nature, and the second, that I experience that these ideas do not depend on my will, nor therefore on myself, for they often present themselves to my mind in spite of my will. Just now, for example, whether I will or whether I do not will, I feel heat, and thus I persuade myself that this feeling, or this idea of heat, is produced in me by something which is different from me. That is, by the heat of the fire near which I am sitting. And nothing seems to me more obvious than to judge that this foreign object sends me its own likeness rather than any other thing. Now I must see whether these reasons are sufficiently strong. When I say that it seems to me that I am so taught by nature, I only mean by the word nature a certain spontaneous inclination that leads me to believe this, and not a natural light that makes me recognize that it is true. But these two things are very different. For I cannot doubt that which the natural light causes me to believe to be true, as for example, it has shown me that I am, from the fact that I doubt, and other such things. For I possess no other faculty that might distinguish the true from the false, and that could teach me that what the natural light shows me as true is not true, and in which I could trust as much as in the natural light itself. But as to inclinations, which also seem to me to be natural, I have often observed, when the question concerned the choice of virtues, that they have as often led me to the worse side as to the better, and I have no reason to follow them in what concerns the true and the false. As to the other reason, which is that these ideas must come from elsewhere, since they do not depend on my will, I do not find it more convincing. For just as those inclinations, of which I have just spoken, are found in me, notwithstanding that they do not always agree with my will, so perhaps there is in me some faculty or power sufficiently capable of producing these ideas without the assistance of any external things, even though it is not yet known to me. And indeed it has always seemed to me that when I am asleep, they are thus formed in me without the aid of the objects they represent. And finally, even though they did proceed from objects different from myself, it is not a necessary consequence that they should be similar to those objects. On the contrary, I have in many cases noticed a great difference between the object and its idea. For example, I find in me two wholly diverse ideas of the sun. The one derives its origin from the senses, and should be placed in the class of adventitious ideas. According to this idea, the sun seems to be extremely small, but the other is derived from astronomical reasonings, that is to say, from certain notions that are innate in me, or else it is formed by me in some other manner. According to this idea, the sun is found to be many times greater than the whole earth. Certainly, these two ideas which I have of the sun cannot both be similar to the same sun. And reason makes me believe that the idea which seems to have originated directly from the sun itself is the least similar of the two. All this causes me to believe that until the present time it has not been by a judgment that was certain and premeditated, but only by a blind and rash impulse that I believed in the existence of things outside me and different from my being, which, by the organs of my senses, or by whatever other means it may be, sent their ideas or images into me, and impressed their likenesses upon me. But there is yet another way of investigating whether some of the things of which I possess ideas exist outside of me. If ideas are taken in so far only as they are certain modes of thought, I recognize no difference or inequality among them, and all appear to proceed from me in the same manner. But when we consider them as images, of which one represents one thing, the other another, it is clear that they are very different one from the other. There is no doubt that those which represent substances to me are something more, and contain, so to speak, more objective reality within them. That is to say, participate by representation in a higher degree of being or perfection than those that represent only modes or accidents. And again, the idea that makes me understand a supreme God, eternal, infinite, immutable, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things which are outside of himself, has certainly more objective reality in it than those ideas by which finite substances are represented. Now it is manifest by the natural light that there must at least be as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in its effect. For whence can the effect draw its reality, if not from its cause? And how could this cause communicate to it this reality, unless it possessed it in itself? And from this it follows, not only that something cannot proceed from nothing, but likewise that what is more perfect, that is to say, which has more reality within it, cannot proceed from what is less perfect. And this is not only evidently true of those effects which possess actual or formal reality, but also of the ideas in which we consider only what is termed objective reality. To take an example, the stone which has not yet existed, not only cannot now commence to be, unless it has been produced by something which possesses in itself, formally or eminently, all that enters into the composition of the stone. Neither can heat be produced in an object if this object was not previously devoid of heat, except by a thing that is of an order, degree, or kind, at least as perfect as heat, and so of the rest. But still further, the idea of heat or of a stone cannot exist in me unless it has been placed in me by some cause which possesses at least as much reality as that which I conceive exists in the heat or in the stone. For although this cause does not transmit any of its actual or formal reality to my idea, we must not on that account imagine that it is necessarily less real. We must bear in mind that every idea, being a work of the mind, has a nature such that it demands no other formal reality than that which it borrows from my thought, of which it is only a mode. But in order that an idea should contain some one particular objective reality rather than another, it must without doubt derive this from some cause in which there is at least as much formal reality as this idea contains of objective reality. For if we suppose that there is something in the idea which is not in its cause, it must then derive this from nothing. But however imperfect may be this mode of being by which a thing is objectively or by representation in the understanding by way of its idea, we cannot certainly say that this mode or manner of being is nothing, nor consequently that the idea derives its origin from nothing. Nor should I imagine also that since the reality that I consider in my ideas is only objective, It is not necessary that the same reality should be formally in the causes of these ideas, but that it suffices that it be found in them objectively. For just as this mode of objective existence pertains to ideas by their peculiar nature, so does the mode of formal existence pertain to the causes of these ideas, at least to the first and principal, by the nature peculiar to them. And although it may be the case that one idea gives birth to another idea, that cannot continue to be so indefinitely. For in the end, we must reach a first idea, the cause of which is, as it were, an archetype, in which the whole reality or perfection is contained formally and in effect. That is found only objectively or by representation in these ideas. Thus, the light of nature causes me to know clearly that the ideas in me are like pictures or images, which can, in truth, very easily fall short of the perfection of the things from which they have been derived, but which can never contain anything greater or more perfect. And the longer and the more carefully that I investigate all these matters, the more clearly and distinctly do I recognize their truth. But one after all am I to conclude, that is to say, if the objective reality of any one of my ideas is of such a nature, that I clearly recognize that it is not in me either formally or eminently, and that consequently I cannot myself be the cause of it. It follows of necessity that I am not alone in the world, but that there is something else which exists, and which is the cause of this idea. On the other hand, if no such idea is met within me, I shall have no argument of any sort that can make me certain of the existence of anything other than myself. For I have searched them all most carefully, and up to the present I have been able to find no other. Now, among all these ideas which are in me, apart from that which represents myself, of which there can here be no difficulty, there is another which represents God, others that represent corporeal and inanimate things, others angels, others animals, and others again that represent to me men similar to myself. As regards the ideas which represent to me other men, or animals, or angels, I can easily conceive that they might be formed by an admixture of the ideas which I have of myself, of corporeal things, and of God, even though there were no other men, nor animals, nor angels in the world, outside of myself. And as to the ideas of corporeal things, I do not recognize in them anything so great or so excellent that they might not have proceeded from myself. For if I consider them more closely and examine them individually, as I yesterday examined the idea of wax, I find that there is very little in them which I perceive clearly and distinctly. Magnitude or extension in length, breadth, and depth I do perceive. Also figure, which results from a termination of this extension. Situation, which bodies of different figures preserve in relation to one another. And movement, or change of situation. To these may be added substance, duration, and number. But as to other things, such as light, colors, sounds, scents, tastes, heat, cold, and the other tactile qualities, I think of these only in a very confused and obscure manner, to such an extent that I do not even know whether they are true or false, that is to say, whether the ideas I have of them are ideas of real things or of non-things. For although I have before remarked that it is only in judgments that falsity, properly speaking, or formal falsity can be met with, yet a certain material falsity may nevertheless be found in ideas, when they represent what is nothing as though it were something. For example, the ideas which I have of cold and of heat are so far from being clear and distinct, that by their means I cannot tell whether cold is merely a privation of heat, or heat a privation of cold, or whether both are real qualities, or are not such. And inasmuch as, since ideas resemble images, there cannot be any whose contents do not seem to represent something, if it is correct to say that cold is merely a privation of heat, the idea that represents it to me as something real and positive will not be improperly termed false. And the same holds good of other similar ideas. To these it is certainly not necessary that I should attribute any author other than myself. For if they are false, that is to say, if they represent things which do not exist, the natural light makes me know that they proceed from nothing. That is to say, that they are only in me, because something is lacking in the perfection of my nature. And if they are true, nevertheless, because they exhibit to me so little reality that I cannot even clearly distinguish the thing represented from the non-thing, I do not see any reason why they might not be produced by myself. As to the clear and distinct ideas which I have of corporeal things, some of them seem as though I might have derived them from the idea which I possess of myself. Such are those which I have of substance, duration, number, and other similar things. For when I think that a stone is a substance, that is to say, a thing which is capable of existing of itself, and likewise that I am a substance, even though I conceive that I am a thinking and non-extended thing, whereas a stone is extended and unthinking, so that these two ideas differ immensely, they yet appear to agree in this, that they both represent substances. In the same way, when I perceive that I now exist, and further recollect that I have in former times existed, and when I remember that I have various thoughts of which I know the number, I acquire the ideas of duration and number, which I may afterwards transfer to any object that I please. But as to all the other qualities of which the ideas of corporeal things are composed, to wit, extension, figure, situation, and motion, it is true that they are not formally in me, since I am only a thinking thing, but because they are merely certain modes of substance, and I myself am also a substance, it seems possible that they might be contained in me eminently. Hence there remains only the idea of God, concerning which we must consider whether it is something which cannot have proceeded from me myself. By the name God, I understand a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, omniscient, all-powerful, and by which I myself, and everything else, if any such things exist, have been created. Now these properties are so great and so eminent that the more attentively I consider them, the less am I persuaded that the idea which I have of them can derive its origin from myself alone. And thus it is absolutely necessary to conclude from all that I have before said that God exists. For though the idea of substance is within me, owing to the fact that I am a substance, nevertheless I should not have the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, if it had not proceeded from some substance which is veritably infinite. Nor should I imagine that I perceive the infinite, not by a true idea, but only by the negation of the finite, just as I perceive repose and darkness, by the negation of movement and of light. On the contrary, I see manifestly that there is more reality in the infinite substance than in the finite substance, and hence that in some way I have in me the notion of the infinite earlier than that of the finite. That is to say, the notion of God earlier than that of myself. For how would it be possible that I should know that I doubt and desire? That is to say, that something is lacking in me, and that I am not wholly perfect, unless I had in me the idea of a being more perfect than myself, by comparison with which I might recognize the deficiencies of my nature. And we cannot say that this idea of God is perhaps materially false, and that consequently I can derive it from nothing. That is to say, that it may be in me in so far as I am lacking in something, as I have just said in speaking of the ideas of heat and cold and other similar things. For, on the contrary, this idea being very clear and very distinct, and containing within it more objective reality than any other, there can be none which is of itself more true, nor any which is less open to the suspicion that it may be false. The idea, I say, of this being so perfect and so infinite is entirely true. For although perhaps one might imagine that such a being does not exist, we cannot nevertheless imagine that his idea represents nothing real to me, as I have already said of the idea of cold. This idea is also very clear and very distinct. For nothing that I conceive clearly and distinctly of the real and the true, and that conveys some perfection, is not contained entirely in this idea. And this is not inconsistent with the fact that I do not comprehend the infinite, or that there is an infinitude of things in God which I cannot comprehend, nor possibly even approach in any way by my thought. For it is of the nature of the infinite that my nature, which is finite and limited, should not be able to comprehend it. And it is enough that I understand this well, and that I judge that all things which I clearly perceive, and in which I know that there is some perfection, and perhaps also an infinitude of others of which I am ignorant, are in God formally or eminently, so that the idea which I have of him may become the most true, the most clear, and the most distinct of all the ideas in my mind. But perhaps I am something greater than I myself imagine, and perhaps all the perfections which I attribute to God are in some way potentially in me, although they do not yet manifest themselves, and do not yet issue into action, for my knowledge increases and perfects itself little by little, and I see nothing that could prevent it from increasing more and more into infinitude. Neither do I see, after it has thus been increased, any reason why I could not thereby acquire all the other perfections of the divine nature, nor, finally, why the power of acquiring all these perfections, if it is really now in me, should not be sufficient to produce the ideas of them. Yet on looking more closely into this matter, I discovered that it cannot be. For, in the first place, although it were true that my knowledge daily acquires new degrees of perfection, and that there are in my nature many things potentially that are not yet there actually, nevertheless, these excellences do not pertain to or approach in any way the idea which I have of the divinity, in whom nothing exists potentially, but all is actual. Is it not an infallible sign and argument of imperfection in my knowledge, that it increases little by little, and that I augment it by degrees? Further, although my knowledge grows more and more, nevertheless, I do not for that reason conceive that it could ever be actually infinite, since it can never reach a point so high that it will be unable to attain to any greater increase. But I conceive God as actually infinite, so that he has reached such a height of perfection that nothing can be added to it. And finally, I understand that the objective being of an idea cannot be produced by a being that exists potentially only, which properly speaking is nothing, but only by a being which is formal or actual. And I should not in truth have any difficulty in all that I have just said, if my mind were not preoccupied, and if I were not accustomed to images of corporeal things. For the idea of God is the only one that is found to be of such a nature that I cannot conceive it could have come from myself. To speak plainly, I am not indeed the cause of my own existence. For if I were, I should not doubt, I should not desire, I should lack no perfection at all. For it is very manifest that it is a much lesser thing to preserve a substance than to create it. And if I had possessed the power of giving myself existence, I should certainly also have possessed the power of giving myself all the perfections of which I have the idea, and thus I should be God. Nor can I escape the force of this reasoning by supposing that perhaps I have always been as I am now, as if that could do away with the necessity of seeking a cause for my existence. For since the whole time of my life may be divided into an infinitude of parts, each of which is in no way dependent on the rest, it does not follow, from my having existed a little while before, that I must exist now, unless at this moment some cause reproduces me, and, as it were, creates me anew, that is to say, conserves me. For it is a thing very clear and evident to all who consider with attention the nature of time, that a substance, in order to be maintained at each moment during which it endures, requires the same power and the same action that would be necessary to produce it and to create it anew if it did not yet exist. So that the natural light shows us clearly that conservation and creation differ only in our manner of thought, and not in reality. Thus, I am forced to ask myself the question, do I possess some power by means of which I may exist in the moment that is to come? For since I am nothing but a thinking thing, if any such power resided in me, I should beyond doubt be conscious of it. But I am conscious of nothing of the kind. And by this I know clearly that I depend on some being, different from myself. Perhaps this being on which I depend is not that which I call God. And perhaps I am produced either by my parents or by some other cause less perfect than God. But this cannot be, for as I have already said, it is perfectly evident that there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in its effect. And since I am a thinking thing and have in me some idea of God, whatever finally be the cause assigned to my existence, it must be allowed that it is likewise a thinking thing, and that it possesses in itself the idea of all the perfections which I attribute to God. We may then again inquire whether this cause derives its origin from itself or from some other thing. For if from itself, it follows by the reasons I have brought forward that this cause must itself be God. For since it possesses the virtue of self-existence, it must also beyond doubt have the power of actually possessing all the perfections of which it has the idea. That is, all those which I conceive as being in God. If, on the other hand, it derives its existence from some other cause than itself, we shall again ask, for a similar reason, whether this second cause exists by itself or through another, until by degrees we finally arrive at an ultimate cause which will be God. And it is manifest that there can be no regression into infinity, since what is here in question is not so much the cause that formerly created me as the cause that conserves me at the present moment. Nor can one suppose that several partial causes have concurred in producing me, and that from one I have received the idea of one of the perfections which I attribute to God, and from another the idea of some other. In that case, the thought that all these perfections could be found united in a single whole could not be correct. For on the contrary, the unity and the simplicity, or the inseparability of all the things which are in God, is one of the principal perfections. That I conceive to be in Him. And certainly, the idea of this unity could not have been placed in me by any cause from which I had not likewise received the ideas of all the other perfections. For no cause could make me understand that they are conjoined and inseparable, unless it had also made me know what they were. Finally, as regards my parents, from whom it appears I have sprung, even though all that I have ever been able to believe of them were true, that does not mean that it is they who conserve me, nor are they the cause of my being, in so far as I am a thinking thing. In no wise do they contribute to the production of the thinking thing that I am. What has there been in all this that could give me an occasion to be deceived, or that could cause me to err, when I consider God and myself together? Certainly there is nothing. For the idea of this being is not fictitious or adventitious, as are the ideas that represent the other things that are perceived by the senses. It is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me. And it is not strange that God, in creating me, should have placed this idea within me, to be, as it were, the mark of the workman imprinted on his work. And it is also not necessary that this mark should be something different from the work itself. But from the mere fact that God created me, it is most probable that in some way He has made me in His own image and likeness, and that I perceive this likeness, in which the idea of God is contained, by the same faculty by which I perceive myself. That is to say, when I reflect on myself, I not only know that I am something imperfect, incomplete, and dependent on another, which incessantly aspires after something better and greater than myself, but I also know, at the same time, that He on whom I depend possesses in Himself all the great things towards which I aspire, and the ideas of which I find within me, and that not indefinitely and potentially alone, but really, actually, and infinitely, and that thus He is God. And my whole argument here comes to the point that since I am not capable of existing by myself, and since, on the other hand, the idea of a perfect being is in me, I must conclude that God exists, and that my existence depends entirely on Him in each moment of my life. And I believe that the human mind can know nothing more evident or more certain than this. And now, from this contemplation of the true God, in whom all the treasures of science and wisdom are contained, I think I can see a way by which I may arrive at the knowledge of all the other things in the universe. First of all, I recognize it to be impossible that He should ever deceive me. For in all fraud and deception, some imperfection is to be found. And although it may appear that the ability to deceive is a mark of subtlety or power, yet the will to deceive testifies without doubt to malice or feebleness, and accordingly it cannot be found in God. In the next place, I know by experience that there is in me a faculty of judging or of discerning truth from error, which I have undoubtedly received from God, along with all the other things that I possess. And since it is impossible that God should deceive me, it is also certain that He has not given me a faculty that will ever lead me into error when I use it aright. And there would remain no further doubt on this point, if it were not that the consequence which I have just drawn seems to imply that I can never err. For if everything that is in me comes from God, and if He has not endowed me with a capacity for error, it seems as though I could never fall into error. And in truth, when I think of God alone, and look upon Him in isolation, and consider Him as the whole of my being, I discover no cause of error or falsity. But directly afterwards, when, turning back on myself, experience shows me that I am nevertheless subject to an infinitude of errors, I recognize that these errors depend on the concurrence of two causes, to wit, on the faculty of knowledge that rests in me, and on the faculty of choice, or on my free will. That is to say, on my understanding, and at the same time on my will. For by the understanding alone, I do not affirm or deny anything, but I merely apprehend the ideas of things, which I can affirm or deny. Nor in considering it precisely in this light does any error ever occur in it. For there may perhaps exist an infinitude of things in the world of which I have no idea. But it cannot for this reason be said that I am deprived of these ideas, as though they were something which was due to my nature. I can only say that I do not possess them. For in truth, I can bring forward no reason to prove that God should have given me a greater faculty of knowledge than He has given me. And however skilled a workman I may represent Him to be, I should not, for all that, consider that He was bound to place in each one of His works all the perfections which He could place in some. Nor, again, can I complain that God has not given me a free choice, or a will sufficiently ample and perfect, since in truth I experience the contrary, that my will is so ample and so perfect that I cannot conceive it to become greater. And what seems to me very remarkable in this regard is that of all the other things that are in me, there is none so perfect and so comprehensive that I do not clearly recognize that it might be still greater and more perfect. For example, if I consider the faculty of comprehension which I possess, I find that it is of a very small extent and extremely limited. At the same time, I find in myself the idea of another faculty much more ample and even infinite. And from the mere fact that I can form the idea of it, I know without difficulty that it pertains to the nature of God. In the same way, if I examine the memory or the imagination or any other faculty I possess, I find none that is not small and circumscribed, while in God it is immense and infinite. It is the faculty of will only, or freedom of choice, which I experience to be so great in me that I cannot conceive the idea of another that shall be more ample and extended, so that it is chiefly my will which makes me know that I bear the image and similitude of God. For although the power of will is incomparably greater in God than in me, whether by reason of the knowledge and the power that are conjoined with it, and that render it stronger and more efficacious, or by reason of its object, inasmuch as in God it extends to a very much greater number of things, it does not nevertheless appear to me to be greater if I consider it formally and precisely in itself. For the faculty of will consists alone in our having the power of choosing to do a thing or to leave it undone, that is to say, to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun, or rather it consists alone in the fact that, in order to affirm or deny, pursue or shun those things which the understanding proposes to us, we act in such a way that we do not feel ourselves to be constrained by any external force. For in order that I should be free, it is not necessary that I should be moved both ways. On the contrary, the more I lean to one side, whether because I recognize clearly that the reasons of the good and true are to be found on this side, or because God thus inwardly disposes my thought, the more freely do I choose and embrace it. And certainly, neither divine grace nor the natural knowledge that I possess ever diminish my freedom, but rather increase and strengthen it. Hence this indifference which I feel when I am not swayed to one side rather than to the other by any weight of reason, is the lowest grade of liberty, and rather evinces a lack or negation of knowledge than a perfection of will. For if I always recognized clearly what was true and good, I should never have to deliberate, touching the right choice, and thus, although I should be entirely free, it could never happen that I was indifferent. From all this I recognize that the power of will which I have received from God is not of itself the source of my errors, for it is very ample and very perfect of its kind. Neither is my power of understanding the source. For since my understanding comes from God, all that I conceive as I ought, and it is not possible that, in this, I should be deceived. Whence then do my errors spring? They spring from this cause alone, that since the will is much wider in its range and compass than the understanding, I do not restrain it within the same limits, but extend it also to things which I do not understand. And as the will is of itself indifferent to such matters, it readily falls into error and sin, and chooses the evil in place of the good, or the false in place of the true. For example, when I lately examined whether anything existed in the world, and I recognized that, from the very fact that I examined this question, it followed very clearly that I myself existed. I could not prevent myself from believing that a thing which I conceived so clearly was true. And this was not owing to any external force that compelled me to it. I was led to this belief simply because, from a great clarity in my understanding, there followed a great inclination in my will. And I believe this the more spontaneously and the more freely as I found myself less indifferent to it. Now, on the other hand, I not only know that I exist insofar as I am a thinking thing, but there also presents itself to my mind a certain idea of corporeal nature, which makes me doubt whether the thinking nature that is in me, or rather which I am, is different from this corporeal nature, or whether both are not the same thing. And I here suppose that I do not yet know any reason that might persuade me to adopt one belief rather than the other. That I am entirely indifferent as to which of the two I should deny or affirm, or even as to whether I should form any judgment in the matter at all. This indifference does not only extend to matters of which the understanding has no knowledge, but also generally to all those which it does not discover with perfect clearness at the moment when the will is deliberating upon them. For, however probable the conjectures may be that make me lean to one side, the mere knowledge that they are only conjectures and not certain and indubitable reasons is sufficient to push my assent to the opposite side. And of this I have had ample experience in these last days, when I set myself to consider as entirely false all that I had formerly held as absolutely true, for the sole reason that I observed that it might in some measure be doubted. Thus, if I abstain from giving my judgment on anything, when I do not perceive it with sufficient clearness and distinctness, it is clear that I act rightly, and am not deceived. But if I affirm or deny in such a case, then I do not make the right use of my free will. And if I affirm what is not true, it is evident that I deceive myself. Even though I judge according to truth, this comes about only by chance, and I do not escape the blame of misusing my freedom. For the light of nature teaches us that the knowledge of the understanding should always precede the determination of the will. It is in the misuse of the free will that the privation which constitutes the essential form of error is found. The privation, I say, is found in the operation itself, in so far as it proceeds from me. But it is not found in the faculty which I have received from God, nor even in the operation in so far as it depends on Him. For I have certainly no cause to complain that God has not given me an intelligence more capable than the one I possess, or a natural light greater than I have, since it is proper to the finite understanding not to comprehend an infinitude of things, and it is proper to a created understanding to be finite. On the contrary, I have every reason to render thanks to God, who owes me nothing, for having given me all the perfections that are in me. And I should be far from entertaining thoughts so unjust as to imagine that He has deprived me of, or unjustly withheld from me, those other perfections which He has not bestowed upon me. Nor have I any cause to complain that He has given me a will more ample than the understanding. For since the will consists only of one single element, and its subject is, so to speak, indivisible, it seems that its nature is such that nothing could be abstracted from it without destroying it. And certainly the more extensive it is, the greater reason I have to thank the goodness of Him who bestowed it upon me. And finally, I must also not complain that God concurs with me in forming the acts of this will, that is to say, the judgments in which I go astray. For these acts are entirely true and absolutely good, in so far as they depend on God. And there is in me, in a certain sense, a greater perfection in that I can form them than if I could not do so. As to the privation in which alone the formal reason of error or sin consists, it has no need of any concurrence of God, since it is not a thing or a being. And if it be referred to God as to its cause, it should not be termed privation, but only negation, according to the meaning of the schools. For in truth it is not an imperfection in God that he has given me the liberty of giving or withholding my assent to certain things of which he has not placed a clear and distinct knowledge in my understanding. But it is without doubt an imperfection in me that I do not make a good use of this freedom, and that I give judgment readily on matters which I only understand obscurely and confusedly. I see, nevertheless, that it would have been easy for God to have caused me never to be deceived, while remaining free, and yet with a certain knowledge of all that I should ever know. He could have done this by endowing my understanding with a clear and distinct intelligence of all the things on which I should ever deliberate, or simply by impressing so deeply on my memory the resolution never to judge of anything without conceiving it clearly and distinctly, that I could never forget it. And I can well understand that, in so far as I consider myself alone, and as if there were only myself in the world, I should have been much more perfect than I am, if God had created me so that I could never err. Nevertheless, I cannot deny that, in a sense, it is a greater perfection in the whole universe that certain parts should not be exempt from error, while others are exempt than if all the parts were exactly similar. And I have no right to complain if God, having placed me in the world, has not called upon me to play the principal and most perfect role. Further, even if I cannot abstain from error by the first and clearest means that I have indicated above, which depends on a clear and evident knowledge of all the things on which I can deliberate, I can at least do so by the other means I have indicated, which depends merely on my remembering to withhold my judgment when the truth of what is being considered is not apparent. For although I have in me the imperfection of not being able to keep my mind continually fixed on the same thought, I can nevertheless, by attentive and oft-repeated meditation, impress it so strongly on my memory that I shall never fail to recollect it, whenever I have need of it. And this is the proper means of acquiring the habit of not erring, and inasmuch as it is in this, that the greatest and principal perfection of man consists, I consider that I have gained much by this day's meditation, since I have discovered the source of falsity and error. And certainly there can be no other source than that which I have explained. For so long as I restrain my will within the limits of my knowledge, so that it forms no judgment except of matters which are clearly and distinctly represented to it by the understanding, I can never be deceived. For every clear and distinct conception is beyond doubt something, and hence cannot derive its origin from what is nothing, but must necessarily have God as its author. God, I say, who being supremely perfect, cannot be the cause of any error, and consequently we must conclude that such a conception or such a judgment is true. Nor have I only learned today what I should avoid in order that I may not err, but also what I must do to arrive at the knowledge of truth. For I shall undoubtedly arrive at this end, if I devote sufficient attention to all the things which I perfectly understand, and if I separate them from the rest, which I apprehend in a more confused and obscure manner, to these latter I shall henceforth give good heed. Meditation 5. Of the essence of material things, and again of God, that He exists. Many other matters respecting the attributes of God, and respecting my own nature or mind, remain for consideration. But I shall perhaps on another occasion resume the investigation of these. Now, after having noted what must be done or avoided in order to arrive at a knowledge of the truth, my principal task is to endeavor to emerge from the state of doubt into which I have these last days fallen, and to see whether nothing certain can be known regarding material things. But before I examine whether any such things exist outside of me, I must consider the ideas of them in so far as they are in my thought, and see which of them are distinct, and which confused. In the first place, I am able distinctly to imagine that quantity which philosophers commonly call continuous, or the extension in length, breadth, or depth, that is, in this quantity, or rather in the object to which it is attributed. Further, I can enumerate in it many different parts, and attribute to each of these parts every sort of size, figure, situation, and local movement. And finally, I can assign to each of these movements any degree of duration. And not only do I know these things with distinctness when I consider them in general, but likewise, however little I apply my attention to them, I comprehend an infinitude of particulars respecting numbers, figures, movements, and other such things, whose truth is so manifest and so well accords with my nature, that when I first discover them, it seems to me that I do not so much learn something new as recollect things that were already known to me. In other words, it seems to me that I, for the first time, perceive things which were already present in my mind, although I had not yet turned my attention to them. And what I think here is most noteworthy is that I find in myself an infinitude of ideas of certain things, which cannot be esteemed as pure negations, although they may perhaps have no existence outside of my thought. And these things are not invented by me, although it resides within my power to think or not to think them. On the contrary, they have natures which are true and immutable. For example, when I imagine a triangle, although there may nowhere in the world be such a figure outside of my thought, or ever have been, its nature, or essence, or form is nevertheless something determinate, and is not a thing which I have feigned or invented, nor does it depend on my mind. This appears from the fact that many properties can be demonstrated of this same triangle, which, if I am to consider the matter aright, cannot have been invented by me. For whether I wish it or do not wish it, I recognize very clearly that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. And I cannot think of a triangle in which this property is not found. Whereas, on the contrary, I am free to feign all sorts of other figures, and to attribute many things to them, without knowing whether these things are true or not. Now the truth of such properties is so clear and so manifest that I cannot possibly doubt them. And this truth is of such a nature that the existence of a triangle is not required to make the conception of it true. For if I suppose a triangle to exist, I must suppose its 3 angles to be equal to 2 right angles. But there is nothing to compel me to suppose that any triangle exists. On the other hand, when I consider the idea I have of a supreme and perfect being, I find that just as the idea of a triangle must contain the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles, so the idea of a perfect being must contain existence. And consequently, existence belongs to the nature of God, just as the nature of a triangle belongs to the nature of a triangle. It is at least as certain that God, the perfect being, is or exists as any demonstration of geometry can be. But, notwithstanding, there are many who persuade themselves that there is a great difference between the idea of God and the ideas of other things, such as the idea of a triangle. And they cannot perceive that the existence of God follows necessarily from his essence, just as the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles follows from the essence of a triangle. But if they would consider the matter more closely, they would see that the idea of God cannot be thought without it being implied that he exists. For in the idea of a supremely perfect being, existence is contained in a particular way, since existence is a perfection. And it is true that we cannot conceive a triangle without its 3 angles being equal to 2 right angles. But it is not true that we cannot conceive of God without existence. We can conceive God without existence, just as we can conceive a mountain without a valley. But there is this difference. In the case of the triangle, we can conceive the figure and yet deny that it has the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles. But in the case of God, we cannot conceive of the highest perfections and deny that he exists. For existence is itself a perfection, and the highest perfections cannot be conceived without the perfection of existence. Thus, when we examine the matter attentively, we see that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the equality of its 3 angles to 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or than the idea of a mountain can be separated from the idea of a valley. And it is just as impossible to conceive a God, that is, a supremely perfect being, who lacks existence, that is, who lacks some perfection, as it is to conceive a mountain that has no valley. Nevertheless, from the mere fact that I cannot conceive God without existence, it does not follow that God exists in reality. For my thought does not impose any necessity on things. And just as I can imagine a winged horse, although no horse has wings, so I might perhaps attribute existence to God, although no God exists. But this is not a true objection. For the idea of a winged horse does not contain necessary existence, whereas the idea of God does. And it is not because my thought can bring this about, or impose any necessity on things, that I am compelled to affirm that God exists. On the contrary, it is because the necessity of the thing itself, namely the existence of God, determines my thinking to conceive it in this way. For I am not free to think of God without existence, that is, a supremely perfect being without a supreme perfection, just as I am free to imagine a horse with or without wings. And it must not be said here that I must necessarily affirm that God exists, after having supposed that he possesses all perfections, since existence is one of them. For my supposition was not necessary. Just as I do not need to think that all four-sided figures can be inscribed in a circle, but on the contrary, I am free not to think so long as I do not suppose it. Nevertheless, if I do suppose it, I am forced to admit that a rhombus can be inscribed in a circle, which is manifestly false. But the analogy does not hold. For although it is not necessary that I should ever fall to thinking about God, nevertheless, whenever I do choose to think of the first and supreme being, and bring forth the idea of him from the treasure house of my mind, it is necessary that I should attribute to him all perfections, although I do not then enumerate them all, or attend to each one individually. And this necessity plainly shows that when later I recognize that existence is a perfection, I am right in concluding that the first and supreme being exists. In the same way, it is not necessary that I should ever imagine a triangle, but whenever I do choose to consider a rectilinear figure composed only of three angles, it is absolutely necessary that I should attribute to it those properties from which it is rightly inferred that its three angles are not greater than two right angles, even though I do not then consider this in particular. But when I consider which figures are capable of being inscribed in a circle, it is in no way necessary that I should think that all quadrilateral figures are of this number. On the contrary, I cannot pretend that this is so long as I do not accept anything that I do not clearly and distinctly understand. And hence there is a great difference between false suppositions such as this, and the true ideas that are born with me, the first and principal of which is the idea of God. For in many ways I recognize that this idea is not something feigned or invented, depending on my thought alone, but that it is the image of a true and immutable nature. First of all, because I cannot conceive anything but God himself, to whose essence existence necessarily pertains. Then, because it is impossible for me to conceive two or more gods of this kind. And because, granted that one such God exists, I clearly see that he must have existed from all eternity, and must endure to all eternity. And finally, because I comprehend many other things in God, none of which I can diminish or change. Further, in whatever way I prove the existence of God, I am always brought back to this. It is only the things that I conceive clearly and distinctly that have the power to persuade me entirely. And although among the things that I conceive in this way, some indeed are manifestly obvious to everyone, while others only reveal themselves to those who consider them closely and examine them attentively. Still, after they have once been discovered, the latter are not less certain than the former. For example, in the case of every right-angled triangle, although it is not so immediately evident that the square of the base is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, as that this base is opposite to the greatest angle, nevertheless, once this has been seen, we are just as certain of its truth. But as to God, if my mind were not preoccupied with prejudices, and if my thought did not find itself diverted by the continual presence of the images of sensible objects, I should recognize nothing sooner or more easily than him. For what is more manifest in itself than the thought that the Supreme Being exists, or that God, to whose essence alone existence pertains, exists. Nevertheless, although it needed close attention for me to conceive this truth, I am now not only as certain of it as of all that appears to me most certain, but in addition to this, I remark that the certainty of all other things depends on it so absolutely that without this knowledge, it is impossible ever to know anything perfectly. For although my nature is such that as soon as I comprehend anything very clearly and distinctly, I am naturally impelled to believe it to be true. Yet because my nature is also such that I cannot keep my mind continually fixed on the same thing, and because I often recollect having judged something to be true when I no longer consider the reasons that made me judge it to be so, it may happen in the meanwhile that other reasons present themselves to me, which would easily make me change my opinion if I were ignorant of the facts about God. And thus I should never have a true and certain knowledge of anything whatsoever, but only vague and changeable opinions. For example, when I consider the nature of a triangle, I, who have some little knowledge of geometry, recognize most clearly that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, and it is impossible for me not to believe this, so long as I apply my mind to its demonstration. But as soon as I turn my attention away from the proof, although I still recollect having clearly comprehended it, it may easily happen that I come to doubt its truth if I am ignorant of the existence of God. For I can persuade myself of having been so constituted by nature that I can easily deceive myself even in those matters which I believe myself to apprehend with the greatest evidence and certainty, especially when I recollect that I have frequently judged matters to be true and certain, which other reasons have afterwards impelled me to judge to be absolutely false. But after I have recognized that there is a God, because at the same time I have also recognized that all things depend upon him, and that he is not a deceiver, and from this I have inferred that what I perceive clearly and distinctly cannot fail to be true. Although I no longer attend to the reasons for which I judged it to be true, provided that I recollect having clearly and distinctly perceived it, no contrary reason can be brought forward which could ever make me doubt of its truth. And thus I have a true and certain knowledge of it. And this same knowledge extends likewise to all the other things which I recollect having formerly demonstrated, such as the truths of geometry and the like. For what can be advanced against me to oblige me to call them in question? Will it be said that my nature is such that I am very subject to error? But I already know that I cannot be deceived in those judgments of which I clearly understand the reasons. Will it be said that I have held many things to be true and certain, which I have afterwards recognized to be false? But I had not perceived any of them clearly and distinctly. And, not yet knowing the rule by which I am assured of the truth, I had been led to believe them for reasons which I have since recognized to be less strong than I had then imagined. What further objection can be made? Will it be said that perhaps I am dreaming, as I myself objected a while ago? Or that all the thoughts which I now have are no more true than the reveries of a sleeping man? But even though I were asleep, all that is present to my mind with evidence is absolutely true, and thus I recognize very clearly that the certainty and the truth of all knowledge depends alone on the knowledge of the true God, so much so that before I knew him, I could not have perfect knowledge of any other thing whatsoever. And now that I know him, I have the means of acquiring a perfect knowledge of an infinitude of matters, not only of those that are in him, but also of those that pertain to corporeal nature, in so far as it can serve as the object of the demonstrations of the geometers, which have no concern with its existence. Meditation 6 of the existence of material things, and of the real distinction between the soul and the body of man. It remains for me to examine whether material things exist, and at least I now know that they might exist, in so far as they are considered as the objects of pure mathematics, since I perceive them clearly and distinctly. For there is no doubt that God possesses the power to produce everything that I am capable of perceiving with distinctness. And I have never judged that something could not be made by him, except because I found a contradiction in conceiving it clearly and distinctly. Further, the faculty of imagination which I possess, and of which I am conscious that I make use. When I apply myself to the consideration of material things, is capable of persuading me of their existence. For when I attentively consider what imagination is, I find that it is nothing else but a certain application of the faculty of knowledge to the body which is intimately present to me, and which therefore exists. And to make this clear, I first mark the difference that exists between imagination and pure intellection. For example, when I imagine a triangle, I not only conceive that it is a figure comprehended by 3 lines, as the geometer does, but at the same time, I also view these 3 lines as though they were present by the force and inward vision of my mind. And this is what I call imagining. But if I desire to think of a chiliagon, I certainly conceive truly that it is a figure composed of 1,000 sides, just as easily as I conceive of a triangle that it is a figure of 3 sides only. But I cannot in any way imagine the 1,000 sides of a chiliagon, as I do the 3 sides of a triangle, nor, so to speak, view them as though they were present with the eyes of my mind. And although, in accordance with the habit I have formed of always employing the aid of my imagination when I think of corporeal things, it may happen that in imagining a chiliagon, I confusedly represent to myself some figure, yet it is very evident that this figure is not a chiliagon, since it in no way differs from that which I represent to myself when I think of a myriagon or any other many-sided figure. Nor does it serve in any way to discover the properties that go to form the distinction between a chiliagon and other polygons. But if the question turns upon a pentagon, it is quite true that I can conceive its figure, as well as that of a chiliagon, without the help of the imagination. But I can also imagine it by applying the attention of my mind to each of its 5 sides, and at the same time to the space which they enclose. And thus I recognize clearly that I have need of a particular effort of mind in order to effect the act of imagination, which I do not require in order to understand. And this particular effort of mind clearly manifests the difference that exists between imagination and pure intellection. I remark besides that this power of imagination which is in me, in as far as it differs from the power of understanding, is in no way a necessary element in my nature or in the essence of my mind. For although I did not possess it, I should doubtless ever remain the same as I now am. From this, it seems we might conclude that it depends on something which differs from my mind. And I easily conceive that if some body exists with which my mind is so conjoined and united that it can apply itself to consider it whenever it pleases, it may be that by this means it can imagine corporeal objects, so that this mode of thinking differs from pure intellection only in this respect, that the mind in understanding in some way turns towards itself and considers some one of the ideas which it possesses within itself, while in imagining it turns towards the body, and there beholds in it something conformable to the idea which it has formed of its own accord, or which it has received by way of the senses. I easily understand, I say, that the imagination could be thus constituted, if it is true that a body exists. And since I can discover no other convenient mode of explaining it, I conjecture with probability that the body does exist, but this is only with probability. And although I examine all things with care, I nevertheless do not find that from this distinct idea of corporeal nature that I have in my imagination, I can derive any argument from which there follows with necessity the existence of any body. But I am accustomed to imagine many other things besides this corporeal nature which is the object of pure mathematics, to wit, the colors, sounds, scents, pain, and other such things, although less distinctly, and inasmuch as I perceive these things much better by the senses, from which, with the aid of memory, they seem to have reached the imagination, I believe that in order to examine them more conveniently, it is right that I should at the same time examine the nature of sense perception, and that I should see whether from the ideas which I apprehend by this mode of thought, which I call my senses, I cannot derive some certain proof of the existence of corporeal objects. And first of all, I shall recall to my memory those matters which I have hitherto held to be true, as having been perceived by the senses, and on which my belief was founded. In the first place, then, I perceived that I had a head, hands, feet, and all the other members of which this body is composed, which body I regarded as a part of myself, or perhaps even as the whole of myself. Further, I perceived that this body was placed in the midst of many others, from which it was capable of being affected in various ways, both beneficial and hurtful. And I distinguished what was beneficial by a certain sensation of pleasure, and what was hurtful by a sensation of pain. And to this pleasure and pain, I added within myself the sentiments of hunger, thirst, appetite, and the corporeal passions. And finally, I also added certain emotions of the mind, such as joy, sadness, anger, and other similar passions. And outside of myself, besides the extension, the figures, and the movements of bodies, I also perceived in them hardness, heat, and all the other tactile qualities. And further, I perceived light, colors, odors, tastes, and sounds, the variety of which gave me the means of distinguishing the sky, the earth, the sea, and all the other bodies, one from another. And certainly, considering the ideas of all these qualities which presented themselves to my mind, and which alone I perceived properly and immediately, it was not without reason that I believed myself to perceive objects entirely different from my thought, namely, bodies from which these ideas proceeded. For I found by experience that these ideas presented themselves to me without my consent being required, so that I could not perceive any object, however desirous I might be, unless it were present to the organs of sense. And it was in no wise in my power not to perceive it when it was present. And because the ideas which I received through the senses were much more lively, more explicit, and even, in their own way, more distinct than any of those which I could of myself frame in meditation, or which I found impressed on my memory, it seemed that they could not have proceeded from my own mind. Thus it must needs be that they were produced in me by some other things. And having no knowledge of those objects except what these same ideas gave me, the only thing that occurred to me was that these objects were similar to the ideas which they caused. And because I recollected also that I had formerly made use of my senses rather than of my reason, and recognized that the ideas which I formed of myself were not so distinct as those which I perceived through the senses, and that they were most frequently even composed of portions of these last, I persuaded myself readily that I had no idea in my mind which had not formerly come to me through the senses. It was not without some reason also that I believed that this body, which by a certain special right I call my own, pertained to me more properly and more strictly than any other. For in fact I could never be separated from it, as from other bodies. I experienced in it, and on account of it, all my appetites and all my affections. And finally, I was touched by the feeling of pain and the tickling of pleasure in its parts, and not in the parts of other bodies separated from it. But when I inquired, consequently, as to why some painful sensation is followed by sadness of mind, and a pleasurable sensation is followed by joy, or why a certain obscure sensation in the stomach, which I call hunger, causes me to desire to eat, and dryness of throat causes me to desire to drink, and so on, I could give no reason except that nature taught me so. For there is certainly no affinity, at least none that I can understand, between the tickling of the stomach and the desire to eat, any more than between the perception of something that causes pain and the thought of sadness which arises from this perception. And in the same way, it seemed to me that I had learned from nature all the other judgments which I formed concerning the objects of my senses, since I observed that these judgments were formed in me before I had the leisure to weigh and consider any reasons which might oblige me to make them. But afterwards, many experiences, little by little, destroyed all the faith that I had rested in my senses. For I have often observed that towers, with their sliding in, which from afar had seemed round, appeared square when seen close at hand, and that colossal statues, erected on the summits of these towers, appeared small when viewed from below. And so, in an infinitude of other cases, I found error in judgments founded on the external senses, and not only in those founded on the external senses, but even in those founded on the internal senses. For is there anything more intimate or more internal than pain? And yet I have sometimes heard it said by those whose arm or leg had been amputated, that they still occasionally seemed to feel pain in the part that they no longer possessed. And therefore, even in my own case, it did not seem to be absolutely certain that some particular member was causing me pain, even though I felt pain in it. And to these grounds of doubt, I have lately added two others, which are very general. The first is that I have never believed myself to feel anything in waking moments, which I cannot also sometimes believe myself to feel when I am asleep. And as I do not think that the things which I seem to feel in sleep proceed from objects outside of me, I did not see any more reason to believe this of those which I seem to perceive when awake. The second is that, being still ignorant, or rather supposing myself to be ignorant, of the author of my being, I saw nothing to prevent me from having been so constituted by nature that I might be deceived even in matters which seemed to me to be most true. As to the reasons which had previously persuaded me of the reality of sensible things, I had no great difficulty in replying to them. For since I seemed to be impelled by nature towards many ends from which reason turned me aside, I did not judge that I should place much confidence in the teachings of nature. And although the ideas which I receive by the senses do not depend on my will, I did not think that one should for this reason conclude that they proceeded from things different from myself, since perhaps some faculty might be discovered within me, though hitherto unknown to me, which produced them. But now that I begin to know myself better, and to discover more clearly the author of my being, I do not in truth think that I should rashly admit all the matters that the senses seem to teach us. But, on the other hand, I do not think that I should doubt them all universally. And first of all, because I know that all the things which I conceive clearly and distinctly can be produced by God exactly as I conceive them, it is sufficient that I can clearly and distinctly conceive one thing apart from another, to be certain that the one is different from the other, since they may be made to exist in separation by the omnipotence of God. And it matters not by what power this separation is made, in order to compel me to judge them to be different. And therefore, from the mere fact that I know with certitude that I exist, and that meanwhile I do not remark that any other thing necessarily pertains to my nature or to my essence, except that I am a thinking thing, I rightly conclude that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing, or a substance whose whole essence or nature is to think. And although possibly, or rather certainly, as I shall afterwards show, I have a body with which I am very intimately conjoined, yet, because on the one side I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, inasmuch as I am only a thinking and unextended thing, and because on the other side I have a distinct idea of my body, inasmuch as it is only an extended and unthinking thing, it is certain that this I, that is to say my soul, by virtue of which I am what I am, is entirely and absolutely distinct from my body, and can exist without it. Moreover, I find in myself certain faculties of thought that are quite particular and distinct from me. For instance, the faculties of imagination and feeling, without which I can easily conceive myself clearly and distinctly as a complete being. But on the other hand, I cannot conceive them without me, that is to say, without an intelligent substance in which they reside. For in the notion that we have of these faculties, or, to use the language of the schools in their formal concept, they contain some sort of intellection. Whence I conceive that they are distinguished from me as the figure, the movement, and other modes or accidents of bodies are distinguished from the bodies that support them. I also recognize that there are in me certain other faculties, such as that of changing place, of putting myself into various attitudes, and the like, which cannot be conceived any more than the preceding apart from some substance in which they reside, and hence cannot exist without it. But it is very evident that these faculties, if it be true that they exist, must belong to some corporeal or extended substance, and not to an intelligent substance. For in their clear and distinct concept there is indeed contained some sort of extension, but there is absolutely no intellection at all. Now there is certainly in me a certain passive faculty of perception, that is, of receiving and recognizing the ideas of sensible things. But it would be useless to me, and I could in no way make use of it, if there were not also within me or in something else another active faculty capable of forming and producing these ideas. But this active faculty cannot be within me, inasmuch as it does not presuppose thought, and also because those ideas are often produced in me without my contributing to it in any way, and often even against my will. Thus it must necessarily exist in some substance different from me, in which all the reality, which is objectively in the ideas that are produced by this faculty, is contained formally or eminently, as I have before remarked. And this substance is either a body, that is, a corporeal nature, in which is contained formally and in effect all that is objectively and by representation in those ideas, or it is God himself, or some other creature more noble than body, in which the same is contained eminently. But since God is no deceiver, it is very manifest that he does not communicate to me these ideas immediately and by himself, nor even by the mediation of some creature in which their reality is not contained formally, but only eminently. For since he has given me no faculty to recognize that this is so, but on the contrary, a very great inclination to believe that these ideas are sent to me, or that they proceed from corporeal objects, I do not see how he could be defended from the accusation of deceit. If these ideas were produced by causes other than corporeal objects, hence we must allow that corporeal objects exist. However, they are perhaps not exactly such as we perceive them by the senses, for this perception of the senses is in many ways very obscure and confused, but at least we must confess that all things which I conceive clearly and distinctly, that is to say, all things which generally speaking are comprehended in the object of pure mathematics, are truly to be recognized as external objects. As to other things, however, which are either only particular, as for example, that the sun is of such a size and such a shape, etc., or which are conceived less clearly and less distinctly, such as light, sound, pain, and the like, it is very certain that, although they are very dubious and very uncertain, nevertheless, from the fact alone that God is no deceiver, and that consequently he has permitted no falsity in my opinions, which he has not likewise given me some faculty capable of correcting, I think I may safely conclude that I possess within me the means of arriving at the truth. And first of all, there is no doubt that in all things that nature teaches me, there is some truth contained. For by nature, considered in general, I now understand no other thing than either God himself or the order and disposition that God has established in created things. And by my own nature, in particular, I understand nothing other than the complexus of all the things that had been given me by God. Moreover, nature teaches me that many other bodies exist around my own, of which some are to be pursued and others to be shunned. And certainly, from the fact that I perceive very different sorts of colors, sounds, odors, tastes, heat, hardness, etc., I very rightly conclude that, in the bodies from which these different perceptions proceed, there are certain variations corresponding to them, although perhaps these variations are not actually similar to the perceptions. And also, from the fact that some of these perceptions are agreeable to me and others disagreeable, it is quite certain that my body, or rather my whole self, inasmuch as I am composed of body and soul, may receive different impressions, both beneficial and hurtful, from the other bodies that surround it. But there are many other things which nature seems to have taught me, but which in reality I have not received from her, but which have become habitual to my mind by my forming rash judgments. And thus it could easily happen that these judgments contain some error. For example, I judged that any space in which nothing was to be found that could move and affect my senses was empty. I also judged that in a hot body there was something exactly similar to the idea of heat that was in me, that in a white or green body there was the same whiteness or greenness that I perceived, that in a bitter or sweet body there was the same taste, and so on, that the stars, the towers, and all other distant bodies were of the same figure and size as they appeared to my eyes, etc. But in order that in this I should perceive nothing that is not distinctly conceived, I must define exactly what I properly understand when I say that I am taught something by nature. For I here take nature in a more limited sense than when I term it a complexus of all the things that God has given me. In this complexus, much is included that belongs to the mind alone. For example, my perceiving that what has been done cannot be undone, and all the other things that are known by the light of nature. Of these things I shall not here speak. Much also pertains to the body alone, for example, that it tends downwards, and the like. Neither shall I speak of these things. I shall only speak of the things that God has given me, in so far as I am composed of mind and body. Now it is this nature which teaches me to fly from things that cause the sensation of pain, and to seek things that communicate to me the sentiment of pleasure, and so on. But I do not see that, beyond this, it teaches me that from these different perceptions of the senses, we should ever form any conclusion concerning things that are outside us, without the mind having first examined them carefully and maturely. For it seems to me that it is for the mind alone, and not for the composite of mind and body, to discern the truth in these matters. Thus, although a star makes no larger impression on my eye than the flame of a little candle, there is yet in me no real or positive propensity to believe that the star is no greater than this flame. But I simply judged it to be so from my earliest years, without any rational foundation. And although in approaching a fire I feel heat, and in approaching it a little too near I even feel pain, There is no reason at all that can persuade me that there is in the fire something resembling this heat, any more than something resembling the pain. All that I have any reason to conclude from this is that there is something in the fire, whatever it may be, which excites in me these sensations of heat and of pain. So also, although there are spaces in which I find nothing to excite and affect my senses, I must not from this conclude that these spaces contain no body. For I see that in this, as in many similar things, I have been in the habit of perverting the order of nature. For the perceptions of the senses, although they have been given me by nature merely to signify to my mind what things are beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part, and although they are sufficiently clear and distinct for that purpose, I yet use them as though they were very certain rules by which I may immediately know the essence of the bodies that are outside me. And of this essence, they can give me only very obscure and confused information. I have already sufficiently considered above how it may happen, notwithstanding the sovereign goodness of God, that there is falsity in the judgments I make in this way. But here presents itself a new difficulty respecting the things which nature teaches me to be pursued or avoided, and also respecting the internal sensations in which I seem to have sometimes detected error. For example, the agreeable taste of some food in which poison has been mixed may invite me to take this poison, and thus I may be deceived by nature. But in this I note that nature can be taken in two different senses. Taken strictly, it signifies nothing other than the laws that God has established for the created world. Taken in this sense, the nature of the body alone is the cause of this error. For according to the laws of nature, when the nerves of the body are affected by some unusual motion, this motion must be communicated to the mind, and must there excite the sensation of thirst. And because on this occasion my whole being is most benefited by drinking, this same motion must also cause the desire to drink. It is therefore not at all strange that the desire to drink should arise from a cause which in other respects is harmful to the body, and that on the other hand, the desire not to drink should arise from a cause which in other respects is beneficial to the body. But if nature is taken in a wider sense, as signifying the complexus of all the things that God has given me, this same motion must also cause the desire to drink. There is much to be found in me that is not to be referred merely to my body, but also to my mind. For example, my knowledge that what has been done cannot be undone, and all the other things that are known by the light of nature. Of these I shall not here speak. But there is also much that concerns the mind alone, and that has no relation to the body. Such are the notions I have of God and of the soul, and of all the things that pertain to pure understanding. There are also other things that concern the body alone, such as the property that it has of being heavy, and the like. Of these I shall not speak either. I shall only treat of the things that I perceive by the senses, and of the things that have been given me by the particular disposition that God has established between my mind and my body. Now it is this nature which teaches me to avoid things that cause the sensation of pain, and to pursue things that communicate to me the sentiment of pleasure. But I do not see that, further than this, it teaches us that from these different perceptions of the senses, we should ever form any conclusion concerning the existence of things outside of us, without the mind having examined them with care and attention. For it seems to me that it pertains to the mind alone, and not to the composite whole of mind and body, to discover the truth in these matters. And thus, although a star makes no larger impression on my eye than the flame of a little candle, nevertheless, I do not recognize any real or positive power in my faculty of sight that compels me to believe that the star is greater than the flame. I have simply judged it to be so from the days of my childhood, without any rational ground. And although in approaching fire I feel heat and even pain when I approach too close, there is certainly no reason that can persuade me that in the fire there is anything resembling this heat, or still less, anything resembling this pain. I can only conclude that there is something in it, whatever it may be, that excites in me those sensations of heat and pain. So also, although there are spaces in which I find nothing to move my senses, I must not conclude that these spaces contain no bodies. For I see that in this, as in many other things, I have been accustomed to pervert the order of nature. For the perceptions of the senses, though given me by nature merely to inform the mind of what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part, and though they are sufficiently clear and distinct for that purpose, I nevertheless use them as though they were very certain rules by which I might immediately recognize the essence of external bodies. But of this essence, they give me only very obscure and confused information. I have already sufficiently examined above how it may happen, notwithstanding the sovereign goodness of God, that there be error in the judgments which I thus form. But here a new difficulty presents itself, both concerning the things which nature teaches me to pursue or avoid, and also concerning the internal sensations in which I seem to have sometimes discovered error. And one example is when the agreeable taste of some food, in which poison has been mingled, may induce me to take this poison, and thus I am deceived by nature. But in this I observe that nature may be taken in two different senses. Taken in a strict sense, it means nothing other than the laws that God has established for the created world. Taken in this sense, it is the nature of the body alone that is the cause of this error. For according to the laws of nature, when the nerves of the body are affected by some unusual motion, this motion must be communicated to the mind, and must there excite the sensation of thirst. And because on this occasion my whole being is most benefited by drinking, this same motion must also cause the desire to drink. It is therefore not at all strange that the desire to drink should arise from a cause which, in other respects, is harmful to the body, and that, on the other hand, the desire not to drink should arise from a cause which, in other respects, is beneficial to the body. But if nature is taken in a wider sense, as signifying the complexus of all the things that God has given me, there is much to be found in me that is not to be referred merely to my body, but also to my mind. For example, my knowledge that what has been done cannot be undone, and all the other things that are known by the light of nature. Of these I shall not here speak. But there is also much that concerns the mind alone, and that has no relation to the body. Such are the notions I have of God, and of the soul, and of all the things that pertain to pure understanding. There are also other things that concern the body alone, such as the property that it has of being heavy, and the like. Of these I shall not speak either. I shall only treat of the things that I perceive by the senses, and of the things that have been given me by the particular disposition that God has established between my mind and my body. Now it is this nature which teaches me to avoid things that cause the sensation of pain, and to pursue things that communicate to me the sentiment of pleasure, and so on. But I do not see that further than this. It teaches us that from these different perceptions of the senses, we should ever form any conclusion concerning the existence of things outside of us, without the mind having examined them with care and attention. For it seems to me that it pertains to the mind alone, and not to the composite whole of mind and body, to discover the truth in these matters. And thus, although a star makes no larger impression on my eye than the flame of a little candle, nevertheless, I do not recognize any real or positive power in my faculty of sight that compels me to believe that the star is greater than the flame. I have simply judged it to be so from the days of my childhood, without any rational ground. And although in approaching fire I feel heat and even pain when I approach too close, there is certainly no reason that can persuade me that in the fire there is anything resembling this heat, or still less, anything resembling this pain. I can only conclude that there is something in it, whatever it may be, that excites in me those sensations of heat and pain. So also, although there are spaces in which I find nothing to move my senses, I must not conclude that these spaces contain no bodies. For I see that, in this as in many other things, I have been accustomed to pervert the order of nature. For the perceptions of the senses, though given me by nature merely to inform the mind of what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part, and though they are sufficiently clear and distinct for that purpose, I nevertheless use them as though they were very certain rules by which I might immediately recognize the essence of external bodies. But of this essence, they give me only very obscure and confused information. I have already sufficiently examined above how it may happen, notwithstanding the sovereign goodness of God, that there be error in the judgments which I thus form. But here a new difficulty presents itself, both concerning the things which nature teaches me to pursue or avoid, and also concerning the internal sensations in which I seem to have sometimes discovered error. And one example is when the agreeable taste of some food, in which poison has been mingled, may induce me to take this poison, and thus I am deceived by nature. But in this I observe that nature may be taken in two different senses. Taken in a strict sense, it means nothing other than the laws that God has established for the created world. Taken in this sense, it is the nature of the body alone that is the cause of this error. For, according to the laws of nature, when the nerves of the body are affected by some unusual motion, this motion must be communicated to the mind, and must there excite the sensation of thirst. And because on this occasion my whole being is most benefited by drinking, the same motion must also cause the desire to drink. It is therefore not at all strange that the desire to drink should arise from a cause which in other respects is harmful to the body, and that, on the other hand, the desire not to drink should arise from a cause which in other respects is beneficial to the body. But if nature is taken in a wider sense, as signifying the complexus of all the things that God has given me, there is much to be found in me that is not to be referred merely to my body, but also to my mind. For example, my knowledge that what has been done cannot be undone, and all the other things that are known by the light of nature. But there is also much that concerns the mind alone, and that has no relation to the body. Such are the notions I have of God and of the soul, and of all the things that pertain to pure understanding. There are also other things that concern the body alone, such as the property that it has of being heavy, and the like. Of these I shall not speak either. I shall only treat of the things that I perceive by the senses, and of the things that have been given me by the particular disposition that God has established between my mind and my body. Now it is this nature which teaches me to avoid things that cause the sensation of pain, and to pursue things that communicate to me the sentiment of pleasure, and so on. But I do not see that further than this, it teaches us that from these different perceptions of the senses, we should ever form any conclusion concerning the existence of things outside of us, without the mind having examined them with care and attention. For it seems to me that it pertains to the mind alone, and not to the composite whole of mind and body, to discover the truth in these matters. And thus, although a star makes no larger impression on my eye than the flame of a little candle, nevertheless, I do not recognize any real or positive power in my faculty of sight that compels me to believe that the star is greater than the flame. I have simply judged it to be so from the days of my childhood, without any rational ground. And although in approaching fire I feel heat and even pain when I approach too close, there is certainly no reason that can persuade me that in the fire there is anything resembling this heat, or still less, anything resembling this pain. I can only conclude that there is something in it, whatever it may be, that excites in me those sensations of heat and pain. So also, although there are spaces in which I find nothing to move my senses, I must not conclude that these spaces contain no bodies. For I see that in this, as in many other things, I have been accustomed to pervert the order of nature. For the perceptions of the senses, though given me by nature merely to inform the mind of what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part, and though they are sufficiently clear and distinct for that purpose, I nevertheless use them as though they were very certain rules by which I might immediately recognize the essence of external bodies. But of this essence, they give me only very obscure and confused information. But, finally, I ought to observe that the senses are not to be trusted when we are concerned with the truth of things, but only when we are concerned with the needs of the body. For from the fact that I feel various kinds of sensations, I can indeed infer that my body is affected in various ways. But I must not therefore conclude that external bodies exist in every respect similar to the sensations I have of them. As I have said, were given to me merely to show the mind what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part. And they are sufficiently clear and distinct for this use. But I cannot, without great rashness, use them to determine the essence of the bodies that are outside me. I ought, however, to remark that the mind is not immediately affected by all parts of the body, but only by the brain, or perhaps even by one of its smallest parts, namely that in which the common sense is said to reside. And whenever this part of the brain is disposed in the same way, it makes the same thing felt by the mind, even though the other parts of the body may be differently disposed, as is proved by innumerable experiments, which it is unnecessary to repeat here. I remark, in addition, that the nature of body is such that no one of its parts can be moved by another part a little removed, which cannot also be moved in the same way by each of the parts that lie between them, even though this more remote part does not act at all. For example, when the cord ABCD is pulled, the last part D is moved in just the same way as it would be if the first part A were pulled, or the intermediate parts B and C were pulled and D remained at rest. In a similar way, when I feel a pain in my foot, physics teaches me that this sensation is communicated by means of the nerves dispersed in the foot, which being extended like cords from there to the brain, when they are contracted in the foot, at the same time contract the inmost parts of the brain to which they lead, and there excite a certain movement, which nature has ordained to make the mind feel a pain as though this pain were in the foot. But because these nerves must pass through the tibia, the thigh, the loins, the back, and the neck, in order to reach from the foot to the brain, it may happen that, although their extremities in the foot are not affected, but only certain parts of their course, through the loins or the neck, this movement excites in the brain the same action as though a hurt were received in the foot. In consequence of this, the mind will necessarily feel a pain in the foot, just as though the foot had been hurt. And the same is true of all the other perceptions of our senses. I observe, finally, that since each of the movements that take place in the part of the brain by which the mind is immediately affected produces only one certain sensation, nothing better can be devised in this matter than that this movement should cause the mind to feel, among all the sensations which it is capable of producing, the one that is the most suitably and the most frequently useful for the preservation of the human body when it is in full health. Now experience shows us that all the feelings with which nature has endowed us are such as I have just described, and therefore there is nothing to be found in them that does not bear witness to the power and the goodness of God. Thus, for example, when the nerves of the foot are violently and more than usually moved, their movement, passing through the medulla of the spine to the inmost parts of the brain, gives a sign to the mind, which makes it feel something, namely pain, as though in the foot. By this the mind is excited to do its utmost to remove the cause of the pain, as harmful and hurtful to the foot. It is true that God could have constituted the nature of man in such a way that this same movement in the brain would have conveyed something entirely different to the mind. For example, it might have made the mind aware of the actual movement occurring in the brain, or in the foot, or in any of the intermediate regions, so well suited to the preservation of the body. Similarly, when we need drink, a certain dryness arises in the throat. This moves the nerves of the throat, and by their means the internal parts of the brain. And this movement, affects the mind with the sensation of thirst, because in this entire circumstance, nothing is more useful to us than to know that we have need of drink for the preservation of our health, and so of the other cases. From these considerations, it is perfectly manifest that notwithstanding the sovereign goodness of God, the nature of man, inasmuch as he is composed of mind and body, cannot be other than it is, and that it is not right to think that God could have created us in such a way that we could never be deceived. For as I have already shown, the proper purpose of the sensory perceptions given me by nature is simply to inform the mind of what is beneficial or hurtful to the composite whole of which it is a part. They are sufficiently clear and distinct, but I use them as though they were absolutely certain rules by which I might know immediately the essence of the external bodies. Of this essence, however, they give me only very obscure and confused information, and it is here that error lies. But I know how to correct it, for I know that in matters concerning the good of the body, all my senses report the truth much more frequently than what is false, and I can almost always make use of several of them to examine the same thing. And above all, I can make use of my memory, which connects the present with the past, and of my understanding, which has already discovered all the causes of my errors. Hence, I ought no longer to fear that those things which are daily shown me by the senses are false. On the contrary, I ought to reject the hyperbolic doubts of these past days as exaggerated and ridiculous. And this applies especially to the principal reason for doubt, which rests on our inability to distinguish the waking state from sleep. For now I perceive a very notable difference between the two, inasmuch as our memory can never connect our dreams with one another and with the whole course of our lives, as it unites the events that happen to us when we are awake. And so, in truth, if someone while I were awake quite suddenly appeared to me and disappeared, as do the images I see while sleeping, so that I could not observe whence he came or whither he went, it would not be without reason that I should deem him a spectre or a phantom formed by my brain rather than a real man. But when I perceive things as to which I know distinctly both the place from which they come and that in which they are, and the time at which they appear to me, and when, without any interruption, I can connect the perceptions I have of them with the whole course of the rest of my life, I am perfectly certain that these perceptions occur while I am awake and not during sleep. And I ought in no way to doubt of the truth of such things, if, after having called up all my senses, my memory, and my understanding to examine them, nothing is brought to evidence by any one of them which is repugnant to what is set forth by the others. For from the fact that God is not a deceiver, it follows that in such matters I am not deceived in any way. But because the exigencies of action do not always allow us to examine things with such careful scrutiny, we must confess that human life is often subject to error in particular things, and we must acknowledge the infirmity of our nature. That is the end. Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes, 1641, complete. And what has happened here? A man alone by the fire has doubted everything: his senses, his body, the existence of the world, the truths of mathematics. He has discovered the one indubitable fact: I think, therefore I am. From that slender thread, he has hung the whole universe. He has proved that God exists and that God is no deceiver. He has shown that the soul is entirely distinct from the body and that it can exist without it. He has demonstrated that the material world is real because the senses, though sometimes deceptive, are given by a truthful God for the preservation of the body. Error arises not from God, but from the misuse of free will, when judgment outruns understanding. The remedy is to withhold assent from anything that is not clearly and distinctly perceived. The 6-day meditation is complete. The mind, purged of doubt, is ready for science. This is the classic mind. Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes is complete. My name is Jamil. You are listening to the Classic Mind.